As the bus wound its way through the winding, narrow roads lined with towering pines, the cast and crew of Shadows of the Dark felt the thrill of entering a place forgotten by time. Cinnavale, a small and obscure town nestled deep in the heart of rural America, was the chosen location for their horror movie. Its dilapidated Victorian houses, empty streets, and perpetual fog seemed almost too perfect, like a set design crafted by the most meticulous hands. For many, it was a dream come true, an atmosphere so immersive they felt they were already part of the story they were about to tell. Yet beneath that initial excitement lay an unease no one could quite shake. The town, though empty of people, didn't feel empty at all. The director, Mason Hale, was particularly drawn to Cinnavale's past, a history that even locals seldom spoke of in detail. Whispers of a vanished film crew from years ago were the only clues he had managed to unearth, but he took it as a thrilling mystery rather than a warning. In his mind, Cinnavale's mystery would lend authenticity to the movie, an energy that could make Shadows of the Dark a masterpiece of horror. As they disembarked, Mason reminded himself of the chilling tales, stories of strange disappearances, odd symbols etched into trees, and a local saying that the fog remembers. Yet, like any true filmmaker, he dismissed these as mere urban legends, stories spun by locals to add allure to a town already steeped in shadow. With the cast and crew settling into their designated accommodations, a sense of isolation began to creep in. The production had arranged for everyone to stay at an old, defunct hotel at the edge of town, known simply as the Pinnacle. The building's once grand halls were now filled with dust and echoes, its former splendor dulled by years of neglect. To most, it seemed like the perfect staging ground for their horror-themed adventure, with every creaky floorboard and dimly lit hallway adding to the eerie atmosphere. But as the night grew darker, the grandeur of the place began to feel oppressive, and the cast found themselves instinctively huddling in small groups, uneasy in the hotel's sprawling, empty corridors. Amelia Hart, the film's lead actress, was among the first to sense something unsettling about Cinnavale. A seasoned performer in the horror genre, Amelia was no stranger to eerie locations and unsettling atmospheres, but something about Cinnavale unnerved her in a way she couldn't easily dismiss. The town's silence was too complete, as though even the birds and insects avoided it. As she took a walk through the town to familiarize herself with the setting, she noticed something odd about the buildings. Every window seemed to have eyes, like a dark presence lingered just out of sight, watching her every move. She shivered, laughing it off as her imagination running wild, but her unease lingered. On her way back to the hotel, Amelia passed by the town's old movie theater. A weathered marquee with missing letters spelled out a hauntingly incomplete message. Shall go on. Curiosity got the better of her, and she paused to peer inside the darkened windows. In the dim light, she could just make out dusty seats and a projector still facing the screen as if waiting for an audience. There was an unsettling timelessness to the scene, as though a screening had been abandoned mid-reel and everyone had simply vanished. She snapped a quick photo and continued on, her footsteps quickening as she made her way back to the hotel. Inside the Pinnacle, the rest of the cast and crew were settling down, swapping ghost stories and local legends they had picked up from the few residents they'd encountered. Oliver, the production sound technician, shared a story about the lost tapes supposedly recorded in Cinnavale decades ago. According to legend, a sound crew working on an old horror film had captured eerie whispers, growls, and blood-curdling screams that didn't belong to any actor or scene. The tapes were said to have been destroyed, but rumors suggested some were buried in Cinnavale's forests, hidden away as relics of an uncompleted project. The others laughed it off as a silly urban myth, though a few glanced nervously over their shoulders. As they prepared for the first day of shooting, Mason gave a brief pep talk, reminding everyone that the eerie atmosphere was precisely why they were here. "Embrace it," he said with a grin, his enthusiasm infectious. "Let the town seep into your bones. We're not just making a horror movie, we're making history." His excitement seemed to reassure the cast and crew, and they went to bed that night with a sense of anticipation. Yet, as silence settled over the Pinnacle, A feeling of watchfulness pervaded the air. The hotel creaked as if it were breathing, and the fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a dark force trying to find its way inside. As Amelia lay in bed, she felt a nagging sense of dread, a feeling that something was just beyond her reach, lurking in the periphery of her vision. She chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion, reminding herself that they were here to make a movie, not live in one. But as she drifted off to sleep, she was haunted by the image of the theater's marquee and the incomplete message. In her dream, the letters rearranged themselves, spelling out something dark, something final. She awoke in a cold sweat, the faint sound of whispering fading into silence as she sat up, wide-eyed and gasping for breath. The first night in Cinevale was restless for many. The cast and crew tossed and turned, plagued by strange dreams and the pervasive feeling that something was watching them from the darkness. Each person brushed it off as pre-shoot jitters, an overactive imagination brought on by the excitement of filming in such a unique location. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, a nagging question of whether Cinevale was truly as deserted as it appeared. The morning sun crept over Cinevale, casting long, pale shadows across its empty streets. It was the first day of filming, and the cast and crew were bustling around the town square, setting up for the initial shots. For the team, the small, abandoned streets and haunting quiet made the town a perfect stage. Mason, the director, had orchestrated everything to ensure Cinevale's unsettling charm would shine on camera. But for all his efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the town was alive, as if the buildings themselves had their own secrets to keep. He shrugged it off, dismissing it as the effect of caffeine and excitement for the day ahead. Amelia, still shaken by her eerie experience from the previous night, approached some locals that morning, hoping to learn more about Cinevale's strange atmosphere. However, the residents she encountered were evasive, quick to change the subject or make an excuse to leave whenever she mentioned the town's history. One elderly woman, however, seemed to hesitate when Amelia mentioned the word haunted. The woman glanced around cautiously before leaning in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Cinevale has its own memories, dear," she said, her wrinkled hand clutching Amelia's. "It's not a place that forgets." Before Amelia could ask her anything more, the woman abruptly walked away, leaving her with a chill she couldn't ignore. As filming began, the crew discovered that Cinevale was not just an empty shell of a town. Every scene they shot seemed to have an inexplicable presence, an energy that electrified the set. They would hear faint footsteps echoing down empty alleys, or shadows flitting just out of sight behind broken windows. At first, they assumed it was part of the setting's charm, an atmospheric boost to the film. Yet there was something distinctly unsettling about these sounds, as though they were more than echoes. It felt as if the town itself were watching them, observing each line, each take, each motion with an intent they couldn't understand. Oliver, the sound technician, began picking up strange distortions during filming. At first, he thought it was merely interference, common enough in such old, rural settings. But as the day wore on, the distortions grew stronger, often taking on an almost vocal quality. Static would burst in at odd moments, usually accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to echo from far away. In one scene, he captured what sounded like an eerie lullaby humming softly over Amelia's lines. When he played the audio back, everyone listened intently, an uneasy silence settling over them as the whispers became louder, clearer, almost as if calling their names. The first scene of the day required Amelia to enter the abandoned theater and call out for a fictional friend who was lost in the eerie building. As she rehearsed the scene, her voice echoed oddly, stretching and distorting in the cavernous space. But as the cameras rolled, Amelia began to feel as though she wasn't acting. Her footsteps on the theater's dusty floor reverberated as though someone else was following just behind her, moving in sync with her every step. She glanced back, half expecting to see someone there, but found only the yawning darkness of the empty seats. Her pulse quickened, yet she forced herself to press on, determined to stay in character. Midway through the take, Amelia froze. She could have sworn she saw someone, a shadowy figure, sitting in the last row of the theater. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was her imagination, a trick of the poor lighting. But as she squinted into the darkness, the figure seemed to shift, as though it were leaning forward, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach turn. She stumbled over her line, momentarily breaking character. Mason yelled "cut" and stormed over, visibly annoyed. Amelia tried to explain, but she could see the skepticism in his eyes. Reluctantly, she let it go, though her nerves were on edge for the rest of the shoot. As they took a break for lunch, the team gathered around a small diner that had been set up with catering. There, one of the younger production assistants, Jake, nervously shared a strange encounter he had that morning. He'd been unpacking equipment near the edge of town when he heard someone calling his name from inside an old shop. He ignored it, assuming it was one of the crew members, but the voice called again, insistent, almost frantic. When he looked around, there was no one there, and the shop had been abandoned for years. Everyone brushed it off as nerves, but the shared glances between the cast and crew betrayed their growing apprehension. The crew's break was soon cut short when they were interrupted by an older man, a local who had been watching them from a distance since they'd arrived. He introduced himself as Henry, a lifelong resident of Cinnavale, and told them that he remembered the last movie filmed here, one that had never finished. They never found them, he murmured, eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. Not one of them. It's like they just vanished into thin air. He laughed darkly, a hollow, chilling sound that lingered long after he left. His warning, cryptic as it was, unsettled everyone, though Mason dismissed it as just another local myth. That night, Amelia found herself restless, haunted by the whispering lullaby from the day's audio playback. As she lay in bed at the pinnacle, she heard the faint sound of humming drifting down the hall. She recognized it immediately. It was the same tune Oliver had recorded. Her heart raced as she strained to listen, realizing the sound was coming closer, its volume increasing with each passing second. She bolted upright, certain someone was outside her door, but when she looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty, save for the creeping shadows cast by the flickering lights. Unable to sleep, Amelia wandered down to the lobby, hoping to find someone else awake. To her surprise, she found Oliver there, sitting in front of a stack of audio tapes, his face pale and drawn. He glanced up at her, eyes wide with fear. "Listen to this," he whispered, pressing play on the recorder. The tape played back, revealing another series of whispers, but this time the words were clearer. Amelia felt a chill down her spine as she heard her own name called softly, almost lovingly, followed by a simple, haunting message. "Stay with us, Amelia. Don't leave us again." Shaken, Amelia looked up at Oliver, but before she could say anything, the tape cut out, replaced by static. The recorder rewound itself automatically, only to stop midway through and start playing the message again. The same words, the same whispers, echoing through the room. And this time, when they looked around, they saw shadows on the walls, shadows that did not belong to either of them, cast by something unseen yet present, watching, waiting. By the third day, Cinnavale's strange atmosphere was beginning to weigh on everyone. The initial excitement had dulled, giving way to a collective unease that clung to the crew like the ever-present fog. The town's quiet seemed less atmospheric now and more oppressive, as if Cinnavale itself were holding its breath, watching and waiting. The locals had grown increasingly reclusive, avoiding eye contact and moving quickly past the film crew whenever they ventured into town. It felt as though an invisible barrier had gone up between the residents and the newcomers, as if Cinnavale were a closed book, unreadable to those who didn't belong. Mason, intent on staying on schedule, tried to keep everyone focused. That day scene was set at the abandoned schoolhouse on the outskirts of town, a looming structure that stood in eerie isolation amidst a tangle of overgrown grass and twisted trees. The building's faded walls and broken windows gave it an uncanny, skeletal look, as though the structure itself had been drained of life long ago. As they prepared to film, Mason noticed how the fog gathered thicker around the school, like a heavy blanket pressing down. He reminded himself that the eeriness was why they had chosen Cinnavale, but something about the fog's density felt unnatural. as though it was concealing something or someone. As Amelia entered the schoolhouse to rehearse her lines, she felt a chill ripple through her. Inside, the air was damp and stale, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and every sound echoed through the empty halls, amplifying her footsteps as though a dozen others were walking alongside her. She wandered through a series of small, dark rooms, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. In the far corner of one room, she noticed an old blackboard, faintly covered in chalk marks that hadn't been fully erased. Scrawled across it were phrases in a childlike script, cryptic warnings that chilled her. They come when called, and never look back. She took a step closer, feeling an inexplicable compulsion to reach out and touch the writing. As her fingers brushed the board, a loud crack echoed through the schoolhouse, making her jump. She turned to see Oliver in the doorway, holding his sound equipment, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia nodded, her heart racing. Neither of them could pinpoint the source of the noise, but the tension between them was palpable. Oliver switched on his recorder, hoping to catch any ambient sounds that might add to the atmosphere. But instead of the typical static and ambient noise, his recorder picked up a rhythmic tapping, like the sound of fingers drumming against a wooden surface. They both froze, staring at the recorder, which seemed to have a life of its own. As the tapping continued, it grew louder, and soon they realized it wasn't coming from the recorder. It was coming from somewhere within the schoolhouse. Mason, alerted by their expressions, entered the room and demanded an explanation. Amelia and Oliver hesitated, but relayed what they had heard. Mason, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as a combination of old building noises and overactive imaginations. "It's a schoolhouse, guys. Buildings settle, they make noise," he said, shrugging off their concerns. But his words rang hollow, and everyone could tell he was forcing himself to ignore the growing sense of dread permeating the set. With the cameras rolling, Amelia took her position in front of the blackboard. The scene required her to read from an old textbook she'd found on a dusty shelf, reciting lines as though she were a haunted teacher lecturing in an invisible classroom. As she began to read aloud, a strange sensation washed over her. The words she spoke seemed to echo back to her from every corner of the room, layering her voice over itself in a disorienting, surreal effect. Suddenly, she felt an overwhelming urge to stop, to turn around and leave the room. But Mason's voice in her earpiece reminded her to keep going. So she pushed through, ignoring the growing whispers that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. Halfway through the scene, the fog outside crept through the cracked windows and open doorways, curling around Amelia's feet like tendrils. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and a sense of profound stillness settled over the set. The crew, watching on their monitors, felt as though they were intruding on something private, something they had no right to witness. Then, without warning, the lights in the schoolhouse flickered, casting eerie shadows that moved in ways that defied explanation. Amelia faltered, breaking character as her gaze darted around the room. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw small figures, like children, huddled in the far corners, watching her with dark, unblinking eyes. Panicked, Amelia stumbled backward, her hand clutching the old textbook tightly. As she fell, the book flew open, its pages fluttering wildly. Oliver's recorder, still running, picked up what sounded like children's laughter, soft, chilling, and echoing through the room. The laughter wasn't lighthearted. It was a hollow, mocking sound, as though it were coming from somewhere beyond the walls, a memory trapped in the schoolhouse itself. Mason called, "Cut," but his voice was shaky, his confidence beginning to falter as the reality of the situation sank in. Back at the Pinnacle that night, the cast and crew huddled in the hotel's lobby, exchanging hushed stories about the day's events. The consensus was that something about Cinevale was fundamentally wrong. Each person recounted their own unsettling experiences, and as the stories layered on one another, the tension grew. It was clear now that these were not isolated incidents. Even Mason, who had dismissed the strangeness until now, seemed unnerved. He sat quietly, listening to each account with a furrowed brow, his skepticism slowly giving way to something darker: fear. Unable to ignore the mounting tension, Mason decided they needed a break from the film's darker themes. He suggested a day off from filming, hoping to lift the crew's spirits and reset the mood. But as he announced this decision, the lobby lights flickered, casting long shadows across the group. A low hum filled the room, a sound none of them could pinpoint. And then, in that sudden, tense silence, the old grandfather clock in the corner chimed 12 times. Except it wasn't midnight. It was only 8 in the evening. The clock's chimes reverberated through the room, louder and louder, each toll seeming to shake the very foundation of the hotel. The fog outside pressed against the windows, swirling and thickening until it almost blocked out the view entirely. The crew looked around, each face reflecting the same dawning realization. Cinevale had drawn them in, and now it wasn't going to let them go. The following morning, the crew awoke to a dense fog, so thick it obscured the streets and shrouded every building in a ghostly haze. It felt as if Cinevale were under a spell, its familiar landmarks erased and replaced by spectral outlines barely visible in the distance. The crew had hoped their scheduled day off would bring some relief, a chance to reset and shake off the collective dread that had taken hold. But the unnatural fog seemed to tighten its grip on the town, seeping through the gaps in every door and window. And beneath it all was a suffocating silence, a stark contrast to the eerie sounds that had plagued them the day before. Amelia had barely slept, her mind replaying the disturbing scenes from the abandoned schoolhouse. She was desperate to escape Cinevale, even if only for a few hours. But when she approached Mason with the idea of driving to a nearby town, he shook his head, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. The thick fog had swallowed up the main roads leading out of Cinevale, making it impossible to navigate. The locals insisted that the fog had always been like this, but there was something unconvincing in their tone, as though they were hiding something. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that the townspeople knew far more than they let on. Desperate for answers, Amelia decided to visit the town's library, a modest building at the far end of the square. She figured she might find some history or legend about Cinevale that could shed light on the strange occurrences. As she entered, the librarian, a wiry old man with piercing blue eyes, greeted her with a somber nod. The library was silent, save for the muffled ticking of an ancient clock mounted on the wall. Amelia explained her interest in the town's history, her voice barely above a whisper. The librarian hesitated, his gaze drifting toward a dusty corner of the room where a single, battered leather-bound book lay on a wooden table. The book was titled The Forgotten Chronicles of Cinevale, and its cover was faded and cracked from years of neglect. The librarian explained that it was the only surviving record of the town's history, though no one had checked it out in decades. He leaned in close, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Be careful what you seek," he warned, eyes narrowing. Some stories don't wish to be told. Ignoring his warning, Amelia took the book and retreated to a quiet corner, flipping through its yellowed pages with a growing sense of unease. The book recounted strange events that had plagued Cinevale for over a century. The town, it seemed, had always been a magnet for misfortune. Fires, disappearances, unexplained deaths. Each entry painted a darker picture of a place that had long harbored secrets. Amelia's hands trembled as she read about the last film crew to work in Cinevale, a group who vanished without a trace in the 1960s, during the filming of a horror movie ironically titled The Cursed Town. The townspeople never spoke of the incident, the record noted, and the film was never completed. The eerie parallel to her own situation was too obvious to ignore. A chill crawled down her spine as she realized they were following a script of their own, one that had been written long before they arrived. One entry in particular stood out to her, dated October 13th, 1923. It detailed a town meeting where residents had reportedly performed a binding ritual to ward off what they referred to as the Watchers in the Fog. The text was vague, but it hinted at a presence the townspeople feared, a force they believed had been awakened by outsiders. The ritual was meant to contain it, but the entry abruptly ended, leaving Amelia with more questions than answers. She read the passage over and over, her heart pounding as she realized they might be dealing with something ancient, something Cinnavale itself could barely contain. When Amelia returned to the hotel, she found Oliver and Jake waiting for her in the lobby. Both of them looked pale, shadows under their eyes betraying a lack of sleep. Amelia shared her discoveries from the book, her voice low and tense. As she spoke, the realization dawned on them that they weren't merely experiencing hauntings or hallucinations. They were part of a cycle, a ritual that had repeated itself with each group that tried to bring new stories into Cinnavale. Every filming attempt had unraveled in inexplicable ways, each crew seemingly swallowed up by the town's history. Jake pulled out his phone and showed them a video he had recorded that morning, hoping to capture the unnatural fog outside his window. What he'd captured, however, was something far more disturbing. Shadows moving in the fog, shifting like figures on the edge of perception, too fleeting to focus on, but unmistakably human. They appeared to linger, watching the hotel, only to dissolve as soon as he moved closer to the window. "They're out there," Jake whispered, his face etched with fear. "Watching us, waiting for something." The crew, now joined by Mason, discussed the idea of calling off the production altogether. But as they weighed their options, the power suddenly went out, plunging the lobby into darkness. Panic set in as everyone scrambled for their phones and flashlights, but the shadows that filled the room seemed to press in on them, thick and suffocating. In the eerie silence, a low hum filled the air, a sound that rose and fell like the chanting of distant voices. Then they heard it, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, whispering in a language they couldn't understand. Suddenly, Mason's flashlight flickered back on, and the shadows dissipated as abruptly as they'd arrived. Breathing heavily, they huddled together, shaken but resolute. Mason, his bravado finally shattered, admitted he was afraid. "I don't know what's happening here, but I don't think we're safe," he said, his voice barely steady. "Whatever's here, it wants something from us." The revelation that Mason, the unflappable skeptic, was now genuinely frightened sent a wave of dread through the group. Amelia, Oliver, and Jake agreed that they needed to find a way to leave Cinnavale, even if it meant abandoning their belongings and equipment. But as they tried to make a plan, a disturbing realization hit them. None of their phones had a signal. Even the hotel's landline was dead. It was as though Cinnavale had cut them off completely, trapping them within its fog-covered borders. The crew was alone, isolated in a town that seemed to be drawing them deeper into its dark history, one twisted chapter at a time. With nowhere else to turn, Amelia decided to return to the library the next morning, hoping the mysterious librarian could offer guidance. As she drifted into a fitful sleep that night, she heard faint voices echoing from the hallway outside her room, soft but insistent, calling her name over and over. She dared not open her door, too afraid of what she might find on the other side. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on her ceiling, haunted by the dreadful certainty that Cinnavale's story was far from over, and that she was now one of its unwilling characters. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the dense fog that lingered over Cinnavale, casting a pale, sickly light on the quiet town. Amelia barely slept, her mind racing with the haunting images from Jake's video and the revelation she had read in the forgotten chronicles of Cinnavale. After a restless night, filled with whispers and shadows dancing across her walls, she was left with one unshakable conviction. She had to return to the library and speak with the mysterious librarian. He seemed to be the only one in town who might understand what was happening and, more importantly, how they could escape it. As Amelia made her way to the library, the streets were eerily empty. It was as if the townspeople had vanished, leaving Cinnavale as a ghost town suspended in time. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a prickle running down her spine with every step. When she finally reached the library, she found it open, yet the building felt even colder and darker than the day before. The librarian was at his desk, his back hunched as he pored over a pile of dusty books. He looked up as she entered, his eyes sharp and expectant, as though he'd been waiting for her all along. Without preamble, Amelia launched into her questions, her voice laced with urgency. She spoke about the shadows, the eerie fog, and the feeling of being drawn into a story not of their own making. The librarian listened intently, nodding as she recounted the bizarre events. After she finished, he sighed deeply, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples as though burdened by a heavy weight. You've stumbled on something ancient, something that has been part of this town long before you arrived, he began. Cinnavale isn't just a place, it's a story itself. A story that demands new characters and new endings. His words sent a chill through Amelia. She pressed him to explain, desperate to understand what they were dealing with. The librarian's voice dropped to a whisper as he leaned closer, his eyes darting around the room as if afraid they might be overheard. He explained that Cinnavale had a dark history, rooted in rituals and sacrifices intended to keep an unseen force at bay. Long ago, the townspeople had come to believe that their town was a threshold, a thin space where reality and something else overlapped. To prevent the Watchers, as he called them, from slipping through completely, they performed rituals, offering something precious to the unseen in exchange for protection. Amelia shivered as she realized that her film crew might have unwittingly triggered these ancient forces by bringing their cameras and lights into Cinnavale. The librarian confirmed her fears. Every few decades, he said, his voice hollow, someone new comes to Cinnavale, and the Watchers grow hungry. It's as if they need a reminder of the living to sustain their existence. Amelia pressed him, asking how the crew could break free from the town's grip, but he hesitated, a flicker of fear in his eyes. There's one way, he whispered, but it's dangerous. The librarian explained that the only way to escape Cinnavale was to perform a reversal of the old binding ritual, an attempt to sever their connection with the Watchers. However, the ritual required both courage and cunning. The Watchers are drawn to fear, he warned. They feed on it. If you're going to do this, you must be resolute. He handed her a small, worn notebook filled with hand-drawn symbols and cryptic instructions for the ritual. This book belonged to one of the last outsiders to try, he added, his expression grave. They failed, but maybe you won't. Clutching the notebook, Amelia left the library with a renewed sense of purpose, but also a heavy dread. The plan was dangerous, and she didn't fully trust that the librarian's advice would lead them to safety. Yet, they had no other option. She gathered Oliver, Jake, and Mason in her hotel room, explaining everything she had learned about the Watchers, the town's dark history, and the ritual that might save them. The three men listened in silence, exchanging uneasy glances. Oliver looked especially pale, his hands trembling as he held the notebook, scanning its cryptic diagrams and words. Mason was the first to speak up, his skepticism finally shattered. If this is what it takes, we do it, he said, his tone decisive. He looked at each of them, his gaze fierce. We can't stay here. We've seen enough to know we're in over our heads. His determination sparked a glimmer of hope in the others. For the first time since they arrived in Cinnavale, they had a plan, however fragile it seemed. Their task now was to gather the items needed for the ritual, as specified in the notebook. A handful of soil from the old cemetery, an item from a loved one, and, strangely, a drop of blood from each participant. With the list in hand, they split up to gather the required items. Amelia and Jake went to the cemetery, a twisted field of ancient tombstones half buried in weeds and fog. As they dug through the cold, damp soil, they couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching them from the shadows. Every creak of the branches and rustle of leaves felt amplified, as though the very earth was alive and aware of their actions. When they finally collected enough soil, they hurried back to the hotel, eager to reunite with the others. Meanwhile, Oliver and Mason searched their belongings for items from loved ones. For Oliver, it was a silver locket his mother had given him, a gift from years past, its sentimental value now tinged with a strange, foreboding significance. Mason contributed his wedding band, a token of a marriage that had ended in divorce but still held a connection to his past. The final task, the blood, was straightforward yet chilling. They used a small, sterile knife from the hotel's first aid kit, each member adding a drop to a small vial, a symbol of their shared pact to escape. That night, under the oppressive veil of fog, they gathered in the field behind the hotel to begin the ritual. The notebook's instructions were cryptic, written in a blend of Latin and English, the handwriting erratic and frantic, as though the writer had been desperate to finish before some unseen force intervened. As Amelia led the group through each step, she could feel a pulsing energy in the air, a charged silence that grew heavier with each word spoken. The watchers, it seemed, were paying attention. The ritual's final step required them to burn the items in a small, controlled fire while reciting a passage from the notebook, a plea for release from the watcher's gaze. As the flames licked at the soil and personal items, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground and up through their feet. The fog thickened, curling around them like living tendrils, and the fire's flames began to flicker wildly, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the ground. It was as if the fog itself were alive, writhing in response to their actions, reacting with a dark intelligence. Then, in an instant, the fog pulled back, retreating across the field in a swift, unnatural movement, as though recoiling from the ritual's power. The silence broke, replaced by a cacophony of distant, haunting whispers, voices layered upon one another, speaking in a language none of them understood. The air grew colder, sharper, and they felt a sudden, intense pressure, as though 1,000 invisible eyes were upon them, watching, assessing. For a long, agonizing moment, they stood frozen, breathless, unsure if they had succeeded or if they had merely angered whatever was lurking in Cinnavale. As the fog settled again, lighter this time, a strange sense of calm washed over the group. The whispers faded, replaced by an almost serene silence. Cinnavale was still, and for the first time since their arrival, they felt an unfamiliar sense of ease. But as they made their way back to the hotel, no one spoke. Each of them was left with the uneasy feeling that they had made a bargain they didn't fully understand, that perhaps the Watchers had granted them a reprieve, but only for now. Returning to the hotel, Amelia and the crew walked in silence, their nerves on edge after the ritual's eerie conclusion. The stillness of Cinnavale seemed deceptive, as if the town itself held its breath, waiting to see if the ritual had truly severed the connection or merely shifted it to something darker. Each step felt heavy, weighed down by the unnatural calm that enveloped them. The fog had receded slightly, allowing glimpses of the moon, but its pale light did little to ease their apprehension. As they entered the hotel, the creaking doors seemed louder than before, echoing down the empty hallways like an omen. Back in her room, Amelia sank into a chair, exhaustion overtaking her. She knew the crew felt the same, worn out not just from the night's events, but from days of anxiety, confusion, and creeping horror. They'd come to Cinnavale to create a film that would grip audiences, but instead, they had been ensnared in the town's hidden story. She glanced around at Oliver, Jake, and Mason, their faces pale and weary, each lost in their own thoughts. After a long, quiet moment, Jake spoke up, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Do you think it worked?" His question hung in the air, laden with doubt. Amelia hesitated, feeling the weight of her answer. "I don't know," she admitted, meeting their uneasy gazes. The fog moved back, the whispers stopped, but there's something else. Like we've only scratched the surface. The others nodded in reluctant agreement, recognizing the gnawing sense that their troubles were far from over. The ritual might have disturbed the Watchers, but they couldn't be certain it had freed them from Cinnavale's grip. Mason, usually the skeptic, surprised everyone by suggesting they stay vigilant. "If we're still here, if nothing's changed tomorrow, we'll need to come up with a new plan," he said grimly, his eyes shadowed with determination. As dawn approached, the crew struggled to find sleep, haunted by strange dreams that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Amelia dreamed of Cinnavale as it might have been decades ago, with townsfolk dressed in old-fashioned clothes, gathering at the edge of a deep, dark forest. They chanted in low voices, their faces blank and trance-like as they disappeared into the trees, leaving a trail of candles that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. She awoke with a start, her heart racing, realizing that whatever ancient power lurked in Cinnavale had seeped into her subconscious. The following morning, the crew gathered in Amelia's room, each wearing the strained expressions of people who hadn't slept well. The air in the hotel felt stale, thick with a tension that seemed to intensify with every passing hour. Despite the pale sunlight streaming through the windows, shadows clung to every corner, refusing to let the light dispel them entirely. Oliver, who had been quieter than usual, finally broke the silence. "I think we need to make a pact," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "A pact of silence. No one speaks of this, of the Watchers, of the ritual of Cinnavale. Once we leave here, if we ever leave." The idea resonated with them, a shared acknowledgement that speaking about their experiences might tether them to the town indefinitely, as if merely uttering Cinnavale's name could summon its darkness back into their lives. They agreed, sealing the pact with a sense of solemnity that bound them more tightly than any contract. Jake, visibly shaken, asked Amelia if she thought they'd really make it out. She wanted to reassure him, to say something comforting, but all she could manage was, "We have to believe that we can." It was the closest any of them had to hope. To test whether the Watcher's hold had truly weakened, Amelia proposed that they attempt to drive to the edge of town. If the ritual had worked, they should find no resistance. If it hadn't, Cinnavale's roads would once again trap them in endless loops. Mason volunteered to drive, feeling he needed to face the strange horror head-on. As they piled into the car, the quiet of the town felt stifling, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. They all held their breath as Mason started the engine, the rumble filling the silence like a heartbeat. As they drove toward the edge of Cinnavale, the streets appeared almost normal. The familiar landmarks didn't shift, and the roads didn't seem to stretch into infinity as they had before. They reached the edge of town, a faded sign reading, "Thank you for visiting Cinnavale," standing crookedly in the grass. Relief washed over them, mingling with disbelief. Jake let out a shaky laugh, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. "We're free," he murmured, but his voice held a note of uncertainty, as though he dared not believe it entirely. Eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Cinnavale, they drove without pause, watching as the eerie town faded into the background, finally disappearing behind the horizon. However, a strange sense of loss crept over them as they left, as if they were abandoning a place that had become a part of them, however dark and twisted. The pact weighed heavily on them, a silent reminder of what they'd witnessed and the horror they might have barely escaped. Back at their homes, life resumed with an odd sense of disconnection. Amelia felt a lingering sense of dread that refused to fade, her memories of Cinnavale sharp and vivid. She kept her pact, never speaking of the Watchers or the ritual, but a nagging thought remained. Had they really escaped? Or was Cinnavale's darkness something they carried with them, woven into their lives forever? Each crew member, though outwardly fine, felt the same shadow following them, an inexplicable cold that settled in the quiet hours of night. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences began to seep into their lives. Mason heard whispers in the wind on solitary walks, and Oliver swore he saw glimpses of a fog that only he could see. Jake, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, checked his phone obsessively, convinced he'd see a figure lurking in the background of his photos. But they stayed silent, honoring their pact, even as the shadows crept closer, as if Cinnavale had left its mark on them, a scar that would never fully heal. By the end of the month, they had all but stopped communicating with each other, each haunted by their own encounters with the remnants of Cinnavale's darkness. Though they tried to move on, the pact weighed on them, a secret they carried alone, unable to share the growing dread that threatened to consume them. In the quiet moments, each wondered if they would ever truly escape the Watcher's gaze, or if, in leaving Cinnavale, they had only brought its horror into a new, terrifying chapter of their lives. In the weeks that followed their departure from Cinnavale, the pact of silence hung heavy over Amelia and the crew like a smothering fog that no daylight could pierce. Each of them had resumed their lives with a veneer of normalcy. Yet the experiences in Cinnavale seemed to weave themselves into the very fabric of their daily routines. Amelia found herself perpetually distracted, a lingering unease tugging at her. She poured herself into her work, hoping that her focus would quell the memories of the town, but her mind betrayed her. The rituals, the fog, the unexplainable sightings, they drifted back in flashes, like fragments of a nightmare that she could not wake from. One evening, as Amelia sat editing the footage they'd taken in Cinnavale, she found herself paralyzed by a sense of dread. She hadn't touched the recording since they'd left, fearful of what might lurk in the pixels. Yet she knew that ignoring them would only amplify her curiosity, and perhaps her fear. With a deep breath, she clicked on the first file, expecting familiar shots of the set and crew. But as the video played, something felt wrong. Shadows clung unnaturally to the corners of the frames, and strange distortions rippled across the screen, as though the footage itself were infected by the town's darkness. As she continued watching, Amelia noticed faint whispers threading through the audio, too quiet to distinguish clearly, but chilling all the same. The voices weren't any of the crews, and though she strained to listen, the more she focused, the more the voices seemed to elude her, slipping just beyond comprehension. She clicked on another video, and the same phenomenon repeated. A strange, eerie distortion that blurred faces, stretched shadows, and filled the background with the faintest hint of a voice. Her hands shook as she realized that these weren't technical glitches. Somehow, Cinnavale's horror had embedded itself into their footage, as if the town had left a piece of itself within each frame. Haunted by the experience, Amelia resisted the urge to reach out to the others. The pact of silence loomed over her, reminding her that breaking it might come at a greater cost. Yet, the need to understand gnawed at her, especially as her dreams grew increasingly vivid. Each night, she was transported back to Cinnavale, where she wandered the fog-laden streets, pursued by unseen figures. Every time she turned, she glimpsed fleeting silhouettes in the distance, watching her with an intensity that cut through her dreams like knives. She would wake drenched in sweat, convinced she could still feel their presence lingering in the shadows of her room. The others, too, found themselves under the shadow of Cinnavale's curse, each in their own isolated way. Mason had taken to keeping all the lights on in his house, his nerves frayed by the growing suspicion that something was hiding in the dark. He could swear he felt cold drafts pass through rooms with no open windows, a sensation that left him shivering despite the warmth of his home. Meanwhile, Oliver noticed strange phenomena on his own phone. Photos he hadn't taken would appear in his gallery, images that were inexplicably blurred, as though someone, or something, had moved past his lens. Jake, who had initially laughed off the others' fears, became the most unhinged of them all. In a desperate attempt to shake the feeling of being watched, he began setting up cameras around his apartment, convinced that he would catch something lurking in the periphery. Every night, he reviewed the footage, only to find nothing, or almost nothing. Some mornings, he would wake to find his cameras unplugged, lying on the floor with no explanation. He tried rationalizing it, attributing it to sleepwalking, but deep down, he knew something far more sinister was at play. Cinnavale, he realized with growing horror, hadn't released them at all. Haunted by these occurrences, the crew started avoiding each other, each unwilling to reveal how deeply they were being affected. Amelia, however, was unable to keep her resolve. She reached out to Mason late one night, her voice breaking as she asked if he, too, was experiencing strange phenomena. Mason hesitated before admitting his own encounters. The two talked for hours, comparing notes and slowly coming to the terrifying realization that Cinnavale had not been an isolated nightmare. Its darkness had followed them, seeping into their lives like an infection. Mason proposed that they gather the crew for a meeting, breaking the pact for the first time since they'd left the cursed town. Though it felt like betrayal, Amelia agreed, hoping that confronting their shared terror might reveal a solution. They met in a small, dimly lit cafe late at night, sitting close together, wary of anyone overhearing them. Oliver and Jake arrived reluctantly, their faces haggard, marked by sleepless nights and thinly veiled fear. The cafe's soft, golden lights did little to dispel the shadows that clung to them, and even here, they felt watched. As they shared their experiences, an unnerving pattern emerged. Each one of them had been plagued by a recurring nightmare, always involving Cinevale and the Watcher's gaze. Worse still, they each reported hearing whispers, glimpsing shadows, or feeling a constant sense of being followed. It was as if Cinevale had cursed them with a persistent echo, a presence that refused to fade even miles away. The pact they'd thought would protect them had instead chained them to the town's lingering darkness, binding them in a new kind of horror. In a final attempt to break free, the group resolved to destroy all evidence of their time in Cinevale. They gathered the film reels, digital footage, and every piece of memorabilia they collected, piling it into an old bonfire pit. As they stood around the flames, watching the footage warp and melt, an eerie silence settled over them. But even as the last of the tapes disintegrated, a sickening realization dawned. The fire had done nothing to lessen the hold Cinevale had on them. The shadows remained, lingering at the edges of their vision, whispering, watching. Defeated, the crew disbanded, each retreating to the isolation of their homes. Days turned into weeks, yet Cinevale's echo persisted, a haunting presence that continued to unravel their lives. Amelia could no longer deny the horrifying truth. Destroying the evidence had only severed the tangible connection. The curse had woven itself into their memories, their fears, and perhaps even their souls. They were bound to Cinevale in a way that went beyond physical artifacts, trapped in a horror that transcended time and distance. As the chapter closed on their shared ordeal, each was left alone, haunted and broken, carrying the silent knowledge that Cinevale would never truly let them go. The sense of dread that enveloped each member of the crew only grew in the days following the bonfire. They had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that destroying the tapes would weaken Cinevale's hold on them. But instead, it felt as if they merely strengthened the curse, angering whatever forces lingered in the darkness. As the days passed, their lives became an eerie reflection of the haunted town they had left behind. The quiet of their respective homes was now filled with faint, untraceable whispers, like echoes of forgotten conversations. These whispers grew louder at night, gnawing at their sanity and eroding the fragile sense of safety they clung to. Amelia felt the whispers most acutely. They seemed to seep into her dreams, merging with her memories of Cinevale until she could no longer tell if she was asleep or awake. Every night, as she drifted off, she would hear a voice, faint yet unmistakable, murmuring her name. At first, she brushed it off as her mind playing tricks, an auditory ghost conjured by her exhaustion. But one night, the whisper grew louder, closer. Amelia lay in her bed, frozen, as it repeated her name with a chilling intimacy, as if it knew her in ways no one else did. She tried telling herself it was just a dream, but the sensation lingered, spilling over into her waking hours. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, and she often felt a cold presence by her side, a tangible emptiness that made her shiver. She'd catch glimpses of her reflection in mirrors, but something always felt wrong. A slight distortion in her expression, a hollow gleam in her eyes that wasn't hers. These small glimpses chipped away at her confidence, filling her with an overwhelming sense of alienation from her own life. Jake, meanwhile, was unraveling in his own way. He began recording audio throughout his apartment, hoping to capture evidence of the whispers that had started to plague him. Listening back to the recordings became a nightly ritual, his way of confronting the unseen force that had invaded his life. At first, the tapes were silent, yielding nothing but the soft hum of his apartment's ambient noise. But one night, as he played back the latest recording, he heard a faint voice among the static. It was a whisper, low and malicious, speaking a language he didn't understand. The voice cut through him, chilling him to the bone. Shaken, Jake deleted the recording, but the damage was done. He knew now that the whispers were real, that Cinevale had somehow followed him home. The paranoia grew, feeding off his isolation and fear. He began keeping lights on at all hours, afraid of the shadows that lurked in every corner. His apartment felt more like a prison with each passing day, and he started to dread the nights, knowing the whispers would return as soon as darkness fell. For Oliver, the whispers took a different form. He had always been the calmest of the crew, grounding them with his steady presence. But even he was not immune to the creeping influence of Cinevale. In the weeks after the bonfire, he found himself losing track of time, hours slipping by as if they'd been erased from his memory. The whispers would call to him, drawing him into a trance-like state where he'd wander his house aimlessly, guided by voices that seemed to emanate from the walls. His wife noticed his vacant stares and blank expressions, and her concern quickly turned to fear. Desperate for answers, Oliver took to researching the occult, hoping to understand the forces that had ensnared them. Late into the night, he pored over old texts and obscure forums, searching for a way to sever the bond with Cinevale. His findings were unsettling, hinting that some places held spirits or energies that could cling to people, binding them with a curse that would last until death. The more he read, the more hopeless he felt, realizing that Cinevale was one of those places, a town steeped in darkness that latched onto those who dared to challenge it. Mason, too, was crumbling under the weight of the curse. The voices he heard seemed to know his deepest fears, whispering his insecurities and doubts in a voice that was unsettlingly familiar. It was his own voice, distorted and twisted, echoing back his worst thoughts. At first, he thought he was losing his mind, but the whispers were too vivid, too real to ignore. They seemed to take pleasure in his fear, urging him to doubt his friends, to suspect that the others were conspiring against him. Paranoia became his constant companion, and he began isolating himself even further, afraid to trust anyone. By now, the group had all but ceased communication. The pact that had once bound them felt more like a curse, forcing them to confront the horrors alone. But the silence only fueled their fear, allowing the whispers to fill the void with doubts and half-truths. Each of them felt trapped, their lives slowly unraveling as Cinevale's darkness seeped deeper into their minds. The whispers grew more intrusive, as if the town itself were feeding off their despair, tightening its grip with every passing day. Unable to bear the isolation any longer, Amelia reached out to Oliver, breaking the pact once more. She confessed her fears, her sleepless nights, and the whispers that haunted her. To her relief, Oliver admitted he was experiencing the same, his own life unraveling under the weight of Cinevale's curse. They agreed to meet again, hoping that confronting the horror together might weaken its hold. Desperation had stripped them of hope, leaving them clinging to each other as their last lifeline. When they gathered, the remaining crew members looked haggard, their faces pale and eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. The whispers seemed to intensify in their presence, filling the room with an oppressive energy that stifled their words. As they shared their experiences, an unspoken truth hung in the air. Cinevale had claimed them, marked them as its own. The whispers, the shadows, the endless sense of being watched. It was all part of the town's legacy, a darkness that would follow them until they broke free, or until it consumed them entirely. They left the meeting with a sense of dread, realizing that Cinevale had woven itself into their lives, like a shadow that couldn't be erased. And as Amelia stepped back in her apartment that night, she knew that the whispers would return, filling the silence with their haunting voices. As time pressed on, each member of the crew found themselves slipping further into the grip of Cinevale's malevolent presence. The whispers that had plagued them for weeks had evolved into something more sinister, something that no longer just rattled their minds, but began to warp their sense of reality. The curse of Cinevale was not merely a haunting of the mind. It had become a suffocating, all-consuming force that was shaping their lives, drawing them closer to the inevitable reckoning they all feared. Amelia, for instance, began experiencing strange shifts in her perception. She'd catch glimpses of herself in the mirror, reflections that were slightly off, as if she were staring at a distorted version of herself. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in her eyes, a crooked smile that lingered a little too long, a sudden, unsettling shift in posture. But as days passed, the discrepancies grew more pronounced. She would find herself staring at her reflection, trying to reconcile the face she saw with the one she knew so well. But it was becoming impossible. The image in the glass seemed to mock her, a silent witness to her unraveling, offering no answers, only more questions. One night, after a particularly restless sleep, Amelia stood before the mirror in her bathroom, her reflection staring back at her with an eerie calm. As she wiped her face, she caught the reflection of her hand, a hand that, for a split second, appeared to be someone else's, a hand covered in strange, dark veins. The sight sent a jolt of fear through her. She quickly looked away, but when she turned back, her reflection seemed to be smiling at her, a slow, creeping smile that wasn't hers. The terror gripped her chest, and she stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her ears. The image in the mirror didn't move with her. It remained frozen, locked in a twisted grin. Shaking, she backed away, finally tearing herself from the mirror. Her breaths were shallow, the sound of her pulse hammering in her head. That night, sleep eluded her, her mind consumed with the thought that her own reflection had become something else, something dark. Had the curse reached even deeper? Was Cinevale now toying with her, manipulating her very image, her identity? The question gnawed at her, its answer as elusive as ever. In the days that followed, Amelia could not escape the feeling that her reflection was no longer merely a reflection, but something that existed apart from her, watching her every move. Each time she passed a mirror, she felt a strange tug of unease, an instinctive need to avoid the glass. She knew, deep down, that if she looked too long, the reflection would not be hers anymore. It had become an entity unto itself, a silent observer of her every action, twisting her image until it was unrecognizable. Jake, too, began to experience a deepening sense of alienation from his own reflection. At first, it was like a low hum, an unease that built slowly, but it soon became unbearable. His own eyes, when he looked at them in the mirror, seemed unfamiliar, as if they were the eyes of someone who wasn't him. He'd sometimes catch himself staring into the glass for longer than he intended, mesmerized by the unfamiliarity that stared back at him. It wasn't just a visual distortion. There was something else, something more unsettling about the way his reflection moved. It was as though his reflection would sometimes pause, blink slowly, or smirk just a fraction of a second before he did. These experiences pushed Jake to the brink of madness. He no longer trusted mirrors, going so far as to cover every reflective surface in his apartment. But the odd thing was, even when the mirrors were hidden, the strange feeling persisted. It wasn't the glass that was haunted. It was his mind, broken by the constant, unrelenting whispers that seemed to grow louder each day, filling every silence with maddening distortion. Every time he looked into the reflection of a puddle or the sheen of his phone screen, his own image seemed to mock him. He could not escape himself. Mason, on the other hand, had started to see his reflection in places it shouldn't have been. It wasn't just the mirrors anymore. It was windows, glass doors, even puddles on the street. He'd catch glimpses of his reflection in the periphery, always standing a little too still, too perfect in its stillness. It wasn't an echo of himself. It was a copy, a haunting version that mimicked his every movement, but with one key difference. It wasn't alive. The reflection stood frozen, staring at him from impossible angles, and always seemed to linger a second longer than it should. This growing sense of distortion in their own reflections was a pattern that began to emerge among the crew. Oliver, too, found himself paralyzed by the image in the glass. He had been trying to keep his head clear, to push away the paranoia and fear that had gripped the others. But the reflection was becoming a problem. The cracks in his mind, the fragile veneer of control, were slowly shattering. He saw himself smiling when he wasn't, his body jerking unnaturally when he was still, and his eyes were always watching him, staring into his soul. It became increasingly difficult for any of them to trust their own senses. Each member of the crew found themselves battling a growing sense of detachment, a growing distance between who they were and what they saw. Their reflections were no longer mere reflections. They were vessels of something otherworldly, something darker than they could comprehend. And as each of them recoiled from the glass, the echoes of Cinevale's curse began to manifest in new, unexpected ways. The boundaries between what was real and what was illusion had begun to blur, and the crew had no choice but to confront the terrifying possibility that the curse had already infected their very selves. They were being consumed not just by Cinevale's whispers or its shadows, but by something far deeper, something that had taken root in their souls and would never let go. It was no longer a matter of breaking free. It was a matter of survival. One evening, after the others had gone their separate ways, Amelia stood before the bathroom mirror one last time. She had to face it. She had to see for herself if her reflection would still mock her. With trembling hands, she wiped away the fogged-up surface, her breath quickening as she watched the mirror clear. Her heart stopped when the reflection came into focus, and for the briefest moment, her reflection wasn't hers. It was as if someone else stood there, staring at her with those same, familiar eyes, but they were empty. Hollow. The curse of Cinevale, she realized, was not just in the town. It had followed them, carving its mark into their very identities, and no matter where they went, they would never escape the reflection of what they had become. The night had fallen heavy over the group. The whispers that had plagued them for weeks were now an inescapable presence. At first, they had believed the source of their terror was rooted in Cinevale. Its abandoned streets and decaying buildings had seemed to be the origin of their curse. But with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that the darkness wasn't confined to the town. It had followed them home. It had followed them into their homes, their minds, and most disturbingly, into their memories. The echoes of Cinevale were now much more than whispers. They had become fragmented flashes of long-forgotten images and fleeting moments that felt more real than reality itself. The crew members would experience strange flashes of scenes, visions of the town they had left behind, suddenly interrupting their day-to-day lives. It was as if the memories of Cinevale had begun to creep into their past, rewriting their histories and shifting their identities. They saw things they shouldn't have remembered, lived lives they had never lived, and recalled moments that had no place in their timeline. Amelia began to have vivid dreams of a time before Cinevale, but it wasn't her past she saw. It was someone else's. She dreamed of a woman whose face she could never quite place. The woman would stand in front of an old house, holding something in her hands, something important, something that felt like a piece of Amelia's own soul. But each time Amelia reached out to take it, the woman would disappear into the fog. These dreams began to blur the lines between the past and the present, pulling Amelia deeper into the confusion of time. It wasn't just Amelia. Jake, too, started to experience these haunting memories, but his were far more disturbing. He would suddenly find himself sitting in a room that wasn't his own, surrounded by people he didn't know, but somehow felt connected to. They would speak to him in a language he didn't understand, but he could hear the words in his mind as clearly as if they were his own. The feeling of being in someone else's life was overwhelming. He was trapped inside a memory that wasn't his, and yet it felt as if he had lived it, as if it was the only reality that had ever truly existed. The intensity of these experiences began to take a toll on the crew. Oliver, ever the voice of reason, became increasingly withdrawn, consumed by the idea that these forgotten memories were trying to reclaim their rightful place in the world. The strange dreams, the flashes of unidentifiable faces, the sense of familiarity in places he had never been. All these things were unraveling his once sturdy foundation. He feared that Cinevale had altered their very beings, reshaping their pasts and futures in its image. No one was who they thought they were, and perhaps they never had been. As the hallucinations grew worse, the group met once more, desperate to understand what was happening to them. They gathered in Oliver's living room, the dim light casting long shadows on their faces, making them look like specters of the people they once were. There was no easy explanation for the horrors they had experienced, but they all understood one thing. Cinevale was more than just a cursed town. It was a place that had the power to manipulate time, to reach into the very fabric of their memories and twist them into something unrecognizable. Mason, whose paranoia had already been growing, became convinced that they weren't just being haunted by the past, they were being erased. His reflection no longer matched his own image. His memories were fragmented, and every day felt like he was slipping further into a life he didn't recognize. He had come to believe that Cinnavale wasn't just a place. It was a force that had consumed them all, rewriting their existence and erasing the true timeline of their lives. The past, present, and future had merged into a chaotic blur, and none of them could trust the reality they now found themselves in. It was Oliver who proposed a theory that seemed as ridiculous as it was terrifying. Perhaps Cinnavale had been some sort of ritualistic place, a town built on the idea of erasure, where the past and the future never existed as they should. The cursed residents of Cinnavale, he suggested, had been part of a pact with something ancient, something beyond human understanding, that could alter time itself. Their memories weren't just disturbed, they were being rewritten. And as each of them continued to experience these flashes of forgotten memories, they were slowly losing their grip on who they truly were. Despite the chilling nature of Oliver's theory, there was something undeniable about the way their lives had been slipping through their fingers. The crew members were no longer living in the present. They were caught in an eternal loop, an echo of a reality that never quite existed. Time itself felt like it was warping, bending in on itself, creating paradoxes and loops that led them deeper into madness. And yet, the worst part was that they couldn't escape it. Every time they tried to break free, every time they tried to go back to normal, the echoes of Cinnavale would return to claim them again. They realized then that Cinnavale wasn't just a curse they could fight off. It was a force that had taken root within them, inside their minds, and perhaps inside their very souls. No matter how far they ran, no matter how many times they destroyed the tapes or burned the remnants of the town, the echoes would always remain. They were forever bound to the forgotten memories of Cinnavale, and those memories would continue to twist their perception of reality until there was nothing left of who they had once been. As the group sat in the dim light of Oliver's living room, each of them lost in their thoughts, they understood that there was no escaping what had already been done. The whispers had become more than just sounds in the dark. They were the very fabric of their existence, weaving a tapestry that could never be unwound. The echoes of the forgotten had claimed them, and now, as they looked into the eyes of one another, they knew that the Cinnavale they had left behind was not a place. It was a part of them, etched into their very being, and they would carry it with them always. There was no going back, and there was no escaping the dark that had taken root in their lives. The group was now undeniably trapped in their own minds, as if the walls of reality itself had begun to close in on them. They had come to understand that Cinnavale was more than just a cursed town. It was a prison of perception, an ethereal labyrinth where the boundaries between the real and the imagined had dissolved. Time had become a fluid construct, memories were malleable, and their identities had become fluid, always shifting, never fully whole. Each day felt like a battle to stay grounded in a world that was becoming increasingly alien, and the town, if it could still be called that, had become a living thing manipulating their thoughts, desires, and fears. At first, the crew members attempted to resist. They tried to anchor themselves to the reality they remembered, the lives they once knew. But the more they fought to stay grounded, the more the world around them seemed to change. It wasn't just the mirages and hallucinations that tormented them. It was the very environment that had begun to warp. The streets of the town seemed to shift when they weren't looking. The buildings would appear in different places the next day, or sometimes entire sections of the town would be gone, erased as if they had never existed. The houses, once familiar and static, seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in strange rhythms, like living organisms that were constantly rearranging themselves. Mason was the first to bring it up, the creeping sensation that their surroundings were no longer predictable. At night, he would wander the halls of their rented house, unable to shake the feeling that the walls were shifting. He would wake up in the middle of the night, only to find that his room had changed. The door would no longer open to the same hallway. The windows wouldn't look out onto the same view. The furniture had changed its position. The layout of the rooms altered in subtle but undeniable ways. It was as if the house itself was a reflection of the fractured state of their minds, growing, shifting, and reshaping according to some unseen hand. Jake, who had initially been the most skeptical of all the crew, was now the most vocal about the changes he was experiencing. He would stand at the window, staring out at the town that no longer felt like the place they had arrived in. The streets seemed longer, darker, the corners of buildings more twisted, as though the entire town was bending under some invisible weight. The sunlight had a sickly hue to it, as if it was filtered through the very air of Cinnavale. Even the people in the town, the few that still remained, seemed like shadows of themselves, fading in and out of view. Jake had started to lose track of time, unable to tell whether days had passed or if the same one was repeating itself over and over again. But it wasn't just the physical world that had begun to twist. It was their very selves that were warping along with it. Amelia began to feel disconnected from her own body. She would look at her hands, feeling them as if they belonged to someone else, watching them move in strange, erratic ways. She tried to speak, but her voice sounded hollow, distant. She wondered if she had even been in control of herself at all, or if some darker force had taken over. Every step she took felt like she was walking in someone else's shoes, lost in a place that no longer made sense. Oliver, for his part, had started to hear whispers, but they weren't the same whispers as before. They were fragments of voices, echoes of long-forgotten conversations, like whispers from people who had never existed. The words would come at him when he was alone, seeping into his mind like water through cracks in a dam. He would find himself speaking to people who weren't there, having conversations with shadows in the corners of the room. And when he looked up to see if anyone else had heard it, the room would be empty, the air still and oppressive. The isolation was unbearable. As the days turned into weeks, the crew began to fall apart. They could no longer tell where the nightmare began and where it ended. Their memories had become unreliable, fragmented, as if their pasts had been rewritten over and over again. They could remember everything up to a certain point, but then there would be gaps, huge, yawning holes where entire years of their lives had been erased. It was as if the curse had reached into their very history, stealing parts of them they would never get back. But it was when they tried to leave that the true horror of Cinnavale revealed itself. They had planned their escape, a simple, desperate attempt to flee the town and all that it represented. They packed their things, gathered their strength, and drove toward the outskirts of town, determined to break free from the curse that had slowly consumed them. But as they drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever, looping back upon itself. No matter how far they drove, no matter how many turns they took, they always found themselves back at the same place. The town square, the heart of Cinnavale, staring at the same twisted streets that had never changed. The crew tried to reason with themselves. Perhaps they had made a mistake. Perhaps they had misunderstood the layout of the town. But as they drove around in circles, it became clear that something far more sinister was at work. The town wasn't just shifting in physical space, it was shifting in time itself. The streets seemed to fold in on each other, and the buildings blurred, their forms fading in and out of existence. It was as if they were trapped in a pocket of time, an endless loop of forgotten moments that had no beginning and no end. By the time they returned to their rented house, defeated, they realized that there was no escape from Cinnavale. Not physically, and certainly not mentally. They were locked in this place, forever, condemned to live out their distorted memories and haunted by the shifting walls that represented the decay of their own minds. The walls had stopped being barriers between rooms. They had become barriers between realities. Every step forward was a step into another forgotten space, another lost memory. And with each passing day, the walls would close in tighter, until there was nothing left of them but shadows. The town itself had become an extension of their fractured psyches, a labyrinth of confusion and despair. They couldn't run from it. They couldn't hide. Cinnavale had become them, and they had become Cinnavale. And in the end, The greatest horror of all wasn't the shifting walls or the distorting time. It was the terrifying realization that they had been erased, just like the town, slipping into the forgotten folds of a reality that would never again make sense. The crew had lost all sense of normalcy. Time, space, and identity had ceased to exist as they once understood them. The more they struggled against the darkness, the more entangled they became in its web. Their bodies moved through Cinevale's warped streets, but their minds were prisoners to a nightmare that no longer felt like a dream. They were not just living in a cursed town. They were living in a fragmented version of themselves. Each step felt like an attempt to escape, only to be pulled deeper into a reflection of their own undoing. As the days stretched on, the crew's perception of reality continued to fray. The idea that Cinevale was a mere town, an isolated pocket of cursed land, became increasingly absurd. Cinevale was not a place. It was a reflection of something darker, something more insidious. It had become a mirror, one that distorted everything it touched. What the crew had initially thought were hallucinations or fleeting nightmares were now undeniable truths. They were not trapped in a town at all. They were trapped in their own reflections. Amelia, the most introspective of the group, was the first to realize this unsettling truth. She was standing before a mirror in their makeshift living space, staring at her own reflection. But it was not her reflection, at least not entirely. She could see her own features, but they were subtly wrong. Her eyes had an emptiness to them, as if they no longer recognized her. The longer she stared, the more she saw the reflection changing, twisting. Her own image grew distorted, as though it was being manipulated by an unseen hand. For a fleeting moment, her reflection smiled at her, a cold, knowing smile that felt like a mockery of her every thought and emotion. At first, Amelia dismissed it as a trick of the light or an overactive mind. But as she watched the mirror, the reflection continued to shift. It no longer just mirrored her physical appearance. It began to mirror her internal struggles. Her reflection began to mimic her actions in reverse, as if the mirror was showing her a twisted, inverted version of herself. Every moment of doubt, every flicker of fear that she had tried to suppress, came to life in that glass. The reflection was not just a reflection. It was a distorted, malevolent version of her own soul. The others noticed the changes in Amelia, too. She became withdrawn, disconnected from reality in a way that was unsettling. She would stand in front of mirrors for hours, staring at herself, her gaze lost in a sea of uncertainty. Her mind seemed to slip further away with each passing day, and soon, the crew members found themselves questioning if the Amelia they knew was still there, or she had been replaced by something darker, something born from the reflections of Cinevale. Jake, ever the skeptic, initially tried to rationalize the phenomenon. He insisted that Amelia's strange behavior was simply a result of the stress they had been under, that their minds were breaking down from the constant pressure of the curse. But even he could no longer ignore the strange occurrences around them. He, too, began to experience odd shifts in his perception. One night, he was sitting alone in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the table in front of him. When he looked up, the reflection of the room in the window seemed to be different. The kitchen, once familiar, had become a distorted version of itself, darker, more sinister, as if the very walls had been drawn inward, tightening around him. His reflection didn't match his movements. When he reached for a glass of water, his reflection remained still, as though frozen in place. The sense of isolation grew as the crew members began to feel more disconnected from each other, more detached from their own realities. They no longer knew if what they were experiencing was real, or if it was simply another distortion in a world where nothing made sense. They tried to communicate, but the words seemed to fall flat, meaningless. Every conversation felt like an echo, repeating the same lines over and over again with no resolution. They were all haunted by the same question. Were they trapped in a town, or were they trapped in themselves? The notion that they were prisoners of their own minds was both a revelation and a curse. They had tried to escape Cinevale physically, but it had become apparent that escape was impossible. Cinevale was not a location in the traditional sense. It was a manifestation of their darkest fears and deepest desires, a reflection of their own fractured selves. The town had no boundaries, no borders. It was as vast as their imaginations and as tight as the grip of their anxieties. The walls they had tried to outrun were not external. They were internal, a part of their very psyche, warped and twisted by the malevolent force that had taken root within them. Oliver, who had once been the group's most logical thinker, now found himself questioning everything. He would see his reflection in the windows, but it wasn't him. It was a version of himself that looked older, weathered, worn. His reflection would look back at him with an expression of sadness, a kind of knowing sorrow that made his stomach churn. The man in the reflection was familiar, but also terrifyingly foreign. Oliver was forced to confront the possibility that the person he thought he was had never existed at all. What if his life, his identity, was just another illusion, another reflection in the mirror of Cinnavale? Mason, the paranoid one, had come to believe that Cinnavale wasn't just manipulating their memories, it was creating them. The town didn't just change the past, it rewrote it. Every moment they had lived, every experience they had shared, was now suspect. He began to question everything, unable to trust even the most basic details of his own life. He would recount conversations with the group, but each time the story changed. What had once been a simple exchange of ideas now seemed to morph into something darker, more sinister. His memories became unreliable, and with each new recollection, he felt himself slipping further into a state of confusion where nothing could be trusted, not even his own mind. The crew's mental state was deteriorating. Their shared reality had become a fractured illusion, a nightmare of their own creation, and yet they were unable to break free. The mirrors were no longer just objects. They were windows into a world where their pasts, their identities, and their very sense of self were being slowly devoured. There was no escape from the mirrors of Cinnavale, no way to outsmart the reflections that had taken over their lives. They were stuck in a cycle, one that was inescapable, trapped within the false realities that had been constructed for them. The crew now understood that Cinnavale was not a town that they had simply stumbled into. It was a mirror, a reflection of their darkest thoughts and fears, a place that had been designed to trap them in an endless loop of distorted realities. They could not escape it because they were not trapped in a town. They were trapped in themselves, and the more they tried to escape, the deeper they fell into the mirror, where every step forward was just another step further into the darkness. They were left to wonder if the true horror of Cinnavale was not the town itself, but the reflections that they would never be able to outrun. With each passing day, the crew's sense of time had eroded to the point of non-existence. In Cinnavale, hours blended together into a murky, indistinguishable haze. Some days, they would wake up unsure whether it was the beginning of a new day or the continuation of the last. There was a discomforting certainty that the town had stretched beyond the physical realm. They had long since abandoned any hope of returning to reality as they had once known it. What had begun as a strange encounter on a movie set had spiraled into an unrelenting nightmare, where the rules of the world seemed to bend, twist, and break at will. The mirrors, the reflections, they were no longer just objects that held their distorted selves. The crew began to feel as though the mirrors themselves were alive, watching them, judging them, forcing them into a cruel game where escape seemed increasingly impossible. The mirrors were not mere windows into alternate versions of themselves. They were the keepers of the town's dark secrets. Each reflective surface now served as a gateway into a deeper and more terrifying dimension. With every look into one, the crew would experience brief flashes of alternative lives, broken fragments of reality where their choices had led them down different paths, some better, some far worse. Amelia, who had been the first to feel the presence of the mirror's power, now believed the reflections were actively trying to break her down. At night, she could hear her own voice calling to her from the mirrors, her words distorted, full of malice. She had been warned long ago that Cinnavale played tricks on the mind, but she had never expected this. Her own voice, her own reflection, turning against her. The words were always the same. "You don't belong here." And every time she heard them, she felt a knot of fear twist deeper into her stomach. The more she stared into the glass, the less she felt like herself, as if her true self was being chipped away, piece by piece. The others had noticed the changes in Amelia too. Her once vibrant personality had become a shadow of its former self, clouded by a growing sense of unease. She would wander through the town, her eyes constantly scanning the reflective surfaces that seemed to follow her every move. She had begun muttering to herself, talking to the reflections in a way that left the crew uneasy. It was as though she had become convinced that the mirrors were the key to unraveling Cinevale's mystery, that somehow the reflections were speaking the truth when nothing else in the town could. Jake had his own struggles with the mirrors, though his were more subtle. He began to notice that his reflection would behave independently of him. It would smile when he wasn't smiling, blink when his eyes remained open, and sometimes it would stare at him with a coldness that made him feel like an intruder in his own skin. The first time it happened, he had dismissed it as a trick of the light, but it became more frequent, more invasive. There were times when he would look at his reflection and feel as though it were trying to communicate with him, but the words were always just out of reach. He could feel something pulling him deeper into the mirror, and the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became. Oliver, ever the skeptic, refused to acknowledge the strange occurrences at first. His rational mind clung to the belief that they were all just experiencing some form of mass hysteria. Yet even he could not escape the creeping sense that something was terribly wrong. It was subtle at first, an inexplicable shiver, a whisper of unease that would ripple through him when he least expected it. But over time, these moments of discomfort grew stronger. One night, while alone in the bathroom, he found himself staring at his own reflection for longer than usual. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. The more he studied his face, the more unfamiliar it became. His own eyes looked foreign, and his features seemed to shift before him, like a face he no longer recognized. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if the man in the mirror was even him at all. What if, like Amelia, his reflection had become something else? What if it had taken on a life of its own, something darker, more sinister? Mason had already fallen into the grip of paranoia, convinced that Cinevale was alive, aware of their every thought, every emotion. He had become obsessed with the idea that the town was feeding off of their fears, amplifying them until they consumed them whole. As the crew ventured further into the depths of the town, Mason was increasingly convinced that Cinevale wasn't just a place. They were the ones keeping it alive. Their reflections were not just a twisted distortion of reality. They were projections of their own fears and regrets. The more they resisted the town's pull, the stronger it became. Mason believed that they were feeding Cinevale, keeping it alive with their fear, and that only by confronting the darkness within themselves could they hope to break free. But confronting the darkness proved to be more difficult than they had imagined. They realized that Cinevale was not simply a reflection of the town itself, but of their individual psyches. The more they delved into the town, the more they uncovered fragments of their own fears and desires, things they had buried deep within themselves. Each alleyway, each street corner, each building they encountered seemed to echo with their own unresolved emotions. The deeper they went, the more they were confronted by aspects of themselves they had never fully understood or never wanted to face. The crew's isolation grew unbearable. They no longer spoke to one another with the same ease. The tension between them had thickened, like a fog that clouded their every interaction. In their hearts, they began to feel that there was no one they could trust, not even each other. Their reflections were not just showing them distorted images. They were showing them their very souls, laid bare and vulnerable. And they couldn't escape. The mirrors were everywhere, and they were forcing the crew to face every piece of themselves they had long since tried to forget. Jake had begun to question the very foundation of his identity. He no longer knew who he was or who he had been before Cinevale. The more he looked into the mirrors, the less certain he became of his true self. His reflection had become a stranger, someone who smiled and laughed, but felt completely foreign. He wondered if he had ever truly known who he was, or if Cinnavale had already begun its work on in the moment he entered the town. Had they been drawn here for a reason, or had they simply stumbled into a trap they could never escape? Amelia had given up on trying to escape the mirrors. The whispers had consumed her entirely, and she now wandered the town, a hollow version of her former self, caught in a cycle of self-loathing and despair. The mirrors no longer showed her the truth. They showed her the worst parts of herself, magnified and distorted until they consumed her every thought. She had become a prisoner to her own reflection, trapped in a world that was not real, but not entirely false either. Oliver, meanwhile, had begun to piece together the fragments of what was happening in Cinnavale. The mirrors were not just reflecting their external appearances. They were reflecting their internal turmoil, magnifying their deepest insecurities and fears. The more they tried to deny these parts of themselves, the stronger the reflections became, feeding on their resistance. In order to escape Cinnavale, they would have to confront the very things they had spent their lives running from. And for most of them, that was a journey they were not prepared to take. As the crew descended deeper into their own minds, Cinnavale's grip on them tightened. The mirrors had become a representation of everything they feared, everything they hated about themselves. They could not escape their own reflections because they were not just mirrors. They were gateways into the very depths of their souls, and the town was forcing them to confront their darkest truths. The more they resisted, the more the town seemed to revel in their suffering. The reflections were not just echoes of the past. They were traps designed to keep them imprisoned in a world where reality was nothing more than a fragile illusion. By the time the crew fully realized the extent of their entrapment, Cinnavale had woven its sinister web too tightly around their lives. It was no longer a question of whether they would escape, but whether they were still capable of distinguishing between reality and the horrors that plagued them. The mirrors had begun to evolve into something far more malevolent. No longer content with merely showing them their reflections, they had started to alter the world around them. Scenes from the past, forgotten moments of their lives, faces of loved ones long gone, memories they had pushed into the darkest corners of their minds, would slip into view when they gazed at the mirrors. But these moments weren't static. They moved, they lived, and they whispered. The crew was no longer sure if the people they saw in the mirrors were merely fragments of their own thoughts, or whether they were seeing into the lives of others who had once passed through Cinnavale. It was as though the mirrors had begun to consume not only their reflections, but also their histories. Amelia, in her fragile mental state, had started to see faces in the glass, faces she didn't recognize, yet felt profoundly connected to. At first, they appeared as mere flashes, broken images of people who seemed to be reaching out to her, beckoning her closer. The more she gave into their allure, the stronger the pull became. She felt as though someone was waiting for her to step into the reflection, to cross into the forgotten realms that the mirrors were pulling her toward. Jake, whose own descent into madness had already been marked by strange behavior, found himself increasingly drawn to the reflections of his past. Faces of people he had wronged, of moments he had failed to apologize for, began to appear in his peripheral vision. It wasn't enough to merely see them. They were calling to him. "Apologize," they whispered. "Make things right." But Jake couldn't move. He couldn't understand why these people, these shadows of his past, were so insistent on making him confront them. He began to wonder if he had been brought here not to make a film, but to face the sins he had buried deep within himself. Cinnavale, he realized, wasn't merely tormenting them. It was forcing them to reckon with the guilt and shame they had been trying to outrun. The town itself had changed in response to their fear. It was no longer simply a deserted movie set. It was an entity of its own, alive and breathing, feeding off of their doubts and insecurities. There was a sense of constant movement, a subtle shifting of the air around them, as though Cinnavale was evolving right alongside them. The crew had long ceased following the original script. The boundaries between reality and fiction had blurred, and the more they tried to hold on to what they knew, the more the town warped their perceptions. They were no longer acting in a film. They were living inside one, with the plot unraveling in ways they couldn't predict. Oliver had begun to notice that the more the crew struggled to make sense of the mirrors, the more Cinevale seemed to twist the truth, stretching it, molding it, until it was unrecognizable. At times, when they would sit together in silence, trying to catch their breath, Oliver could swear that the walls of Cinevale would begin to pulse in rhythm with their thoughts. He began to question whether they were in control of their actions at all, or whether Cinevale had begun to dominate them, pulling the strings, forcing them into a never-ending cycle of fear and self-loathing. The mirrors had become like portals, opening up into an ever-expanding web of broken truths and lost moments. The more Oliver tried to resist the inevitable, the more he saw the town as a reflection of his own mind. He was haunted by the idea that Cinevale wasn't just a place, it was a manifestation of their collective fears, each member of the crew representing a different corner of human fragility. He wondered if the town existed as a warning, a test of their psyche. Were they trapped because they had failed in some fundamental way, or were they merely caught in a cosmic game, a sick experiment of sorts? The town seemed to feed off their confusion, their attempts to rationalize the irrational, and the longer they stayed, the further they fell from any semblance of clarity. Mason, too, had his doubts about their reality, but his paranoia had reached a fever pitch. He had begun to isolate himself from the others, convinced that trusting anyone in this place would be his downfall. The mirrors, he believed, weren't just showing them reflections. They were altering their very essence. Each time he passed one, his face seemed to change, his features stretching and contorting as though the town was warping his identity. Sometimes he would stare at his reflection for so long that he couldn't remember whether the face in the glass was his or the face of someone else. He had become obsessed with the idea that Cinevale was trying to replace them, that they were slowly losing their individuality, becoming interchangeable parts of the town's malevolent design. In the midst of this growing madness, the crew tried to piece together what was happening to them. They spoke less and less, as if words had become irrelevant in a town where meaning no longer existed. They would gather, if only for brief moments, to share their latest discoveries, but their conclusions always seemed to bring more confusion than clarity. Amelia, who had once been the most rational of them all, had all but given up on reason. She had accepted the town for what it was, surrendering to its hold. She no longer cared about leaving. She had begun to see Cinevale as her new home, a place where she could finally be free from the constraints of reality. Jake, however, could not let go. He had clung to the idea of returning to their old lives, to the world outside of Cinevale. But the more he thought about it, the more distant that world felt. He began to wonder if they were simply extensions of the film they had come to make. Perhaps they were just characters in a story that had long since lost its ending. As the days wore on, the line between the film they had started and the nightmare they had found themselves in became less and less clear. In the mirrors, Jake saw his reflection smiling back at him. No longer the man he had been, but something darker, something that was no longer him at all. Oliver, who had once been a skeptic, now believed that Cinevale had become a reflection of their collective subconscious, a place where their deepest fears, regrets, and desires manifested in ways they could neither control nor comprehend. Each passing day, the mirrors became more oppressive, more consuming. They weren't just looking into reflections anymore. They were looking into the very fabric of their souls, and what they saw was not comforting. The mirrors showed the truth, but the truth was something they were unwilling to face. And so, trapped in a town that bled into the very fabric of their minds, the crew's descent into madness continued. The mirrors reflected a world where reality no longer existed, a world where nothing could be trusted. They had become prisoners of Cinevale, but worse than that, they had become prisoners of themselves. The town had not just captured their bodies, it had captured their souls, forcing them to confront the one thing they could never escape, who they truly were. The mirrors no longer showed them reflections. They showed them their truth, a truth they could no longer hide from. The silence had become unbearable in a place like Cinevale, where every whisper seemed to carry the weight of eternity. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a warning, and every glance toward a mirror seemed to unveil yet another hidden truth the absence of sound was a cruel twist. The crew had spent so much time grappling with their own unraveling thoughts that they had forgotten how to speak to one another. Their words, once sharp and clear, had dissolved into nonsensical murmurs, or at best, hollow echoes that reverberated back at them from the very town itself. They had lost not just their sense of place, but their sense of self. What remained was the dreadful sense that the town itself was listening, as though Cinevale were not merely a backdrop, but an entity that had become attuned to their deepest fears, their unsaid thoughts, and their darkest desires. It was no longer clear whether the crew was still making a film, or if they had become part of the horror. The lines between fiction and reality had long blurred, and the very essence of Cinevale seemed to pulse with a malicious intent, as if it had become aware of the havoc it was wreaking on their minds. The mirrors, once simple props on set, had transformed into instruments of torment. They no longer just reflected their image. They projected images from the past, faces and places they had long since forgotten. Some of these images were distorted, the people in them twisted by time, while others were eerily clear. Each time they looked into a mirror, the images would shift, rearranging themselves, distorting their perception of the present. Amelia had taken to avoiding the mirrors entirely. She couldn't bear to see the faces that greeted her each time she dared to glance into the glass. They weren't the faces of anyone she knew, but they felt like part of her, as though the people in the reflections were pieces of herself she had lost along the way. Faces of children, of lovers, of parents, some smiling, some crying, all begging for her attention. The more she avoided the mirrors, the more they called to her, their silent cries filling her every thought. She had grown paranoid, even questioning whether the mirrors were the only things in Cinevale that were truly real. Were they the last remnants of a world that had long since crumbled? Or were they a part of something darker, something that was starting to envelop the town itself? Jake, meanwhile, had become consumed by the silence in a different way. While Amelia recoiled from the mirrors, he had started to engage with them more intensely. He would sit in front of a reflective surface for hours, trying to piece together the puzzle that had become his life. He would look into the glass, waiting for the faces of the people he had wronged to appear. Sometimes they would, but they didn't speak. They just stared back at him with accusing eyes, as if they had been waiting all this time for him to acknowledge the damage he had done. Other times, the mirrors would show him something new, a life he could have had, a family he never started, a dream he never pursued. It was maddening, this sense that the mirrors were showing him every alternate version of himself. A man who had made different choices, who had lived a different life. But it wasn't enough. No matter how much he stared, the reflection would never change. It wasn't the past he was seeing. It was the unfulfilled potential of his future. The mirrors, however, weren't Jake's only source of torment. He had started hearing things, whispers low and guttural, that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He would be sitting in his room, staring at the wall, when a voice would slither into his ear. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, the result of too much stress, too much isolation. But as time passed, the voices grew clearer, more insistent. They spoke of things he couldn't understand, of cryptic messages and veiled threats. The worst part was that the voices didn't seem to come from anyone. They didn't belong to anyone in the crew, nor did they sound like any human voice he had ever heard. They were deeper, older, as though they had been waiting in the bowels of Cinevale for eons. And worse still, they didn't speak to him directly. They whispered, just out of earshot, always just beyond his understanding. Oliver, ever the skeptic, tried to convince the crew that the voices were nothing more than hallucinations brought on by the stress of the situation. But even he couldn't deny the oddness that had begun to permeate their world. The town itself seemed to have taken on a life of its own, as though it were somehow aware of their presence and was responding in kind. He had begun to notice strange occurrences around Cinevale. Objects would move when no one was looking, lights would flicker without explanation, and the very air seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The mirrors, too, had started to show things that weren't just reflections. In the dead of night, he would look into them and see brief flashes of shadowy figures darting in and out of the glass. They weren't human, They were something else, something darker, something that had no place in their reality. Mason had also been affected, though in a much more destructive way. His obsession with the town's history had consumed him to the point where he could no longer tell whether the stories he was uncovering were real or merely products of his own unraveling mind. He spent days digging through old archives, speaking to the few remaining townsfolk who had once been a part of Cinnavale's glory days. The more he learned, the more he became convinced that Cinnavale wasn't merely a movie set. It was a place cursed by a past it could never escape. The town's origins were murky, filled with rumors of strange rituals, unspeakable horrors, and a dark presence that had always haunted its streets. What bothered him the most was the discovery that the town had never been abandoned. No, it had been sealed off, locked away from the world for reasons Mason couldn't fully understand. What had happened here? And why had they been drawn to it? As the days dragged on, the crew began to notice that their sense of time was deteriorating. They no longer knew whether it was morning or night, whether they had been in Cinnavale for weeks or years. The clocks had stopped working. The sun no longer rose or set at regular intervals. It was as though time itself had become meaningless within the walls of Cinnavale. This distorted sense of time further exacerbated their isolation, heightening the disorientation that already plagued their minds. They couldn't remember what it felt like to be outside, to feel the sun on their skin or the wind in their hair. All they knew was the town, and the town had become a labyrinth of fear, where every corner hid something new, something terrifying. It was at this point that the crew began to acknowledge a truth they had long been unwilling to admit. They were trapped, not physically but mentally, emotionally. Cinnavale had begun to chip away at their very identities, reducing them to mere husks of the people they had once been. The mirrors were not just showing them reflections, they were showing them how far they had fallen. The town and the mirrors within it were not just haunting them. They were rewriting their lives, erasing who they had been, and replacing them with something much darker. And now, they were nothing but echoes in the silence of a town that had long since forgotten how to let go. By the time the crew acknowledged their fate, Cinnavale had ceased to feel like a mere movie set. It was now a character in its own right, one that had become more powerful, more aware, than any of them had ever anticipated. The silence, the haunting visions in the mirrors, the whispering voices that began to bleed into the real world. They were no longer just remnants of a horror film. They were symptoms of something far more insidious, something that had been silently weaving its threads through the very fabric of the town for decades. And now, the crew was beginning to understand the full extent of what they had stumbled into. They were no longer part of the story. They were the story. It wasn't just the isolation, nor the growing madness that was slowly seeping into their minds. It was the fact that deep down, they had all come to realize that Cinnavale wasn't simply an abandoned movie town. It was a tomb for forgotten stories. Stories of people who had once lived there, or perhaps people who had never lived at all. What the mirrors showed them wasn't just reflections of themselves, nor images of their past lives. What they saw were glimpses of the souls that had been trapped within the town, their stories unfinished, their lives cut short by some unseen hand. These souls had been waiting for someone, anyone, to finish their stories. And in doing so, they had woven themselves into the very essence of the town. Amelia had been the first to encounter them in a way that truly unsettled her. It happened late one night, when the crew had been gathered around the flickering light of a dying fire. There were no more discussions of how to escape or what to do next. It had become clear that none of them had the answers. As she sat by the fire, staring into the flames, Amelia's gaze wandered toward one of the mirrors that had been placed in the corner of the room. At first, she saw only her own reflection, pale and drawn. But as she continued to stare, the reflection began to shift, the shadows in the glass stretching and pulling in ways that didn't align with the room behind her. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a face she had never seen before, yet somehow knew. It was a woman, her features worn and hollow, like the remains of someone who had been starved for years. The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, Amelia's mind filled with a sudden, overwhelming sense of despair. The woman's face was a manifestation of something deep inside her, a fear, a regret, a sorrow that she hadn't fully understood until that moment. It was as if this woman represented every mistake Amelia had ever made, every opportunity lost, every choice that had led her here. The woman's hollow eyes seemed to speak to her, though the words went unheard. Amelia backed away from the mirror in a panic, her heart pounding in her chest. But even as she pulled herself from the reflection, the woman's face lingered in her mind, haunting her thoughts. And for the first time, she realized that the town itself wasn't merely trapping them. It was trying to use them. The town was alive, feeding on the stories of those who had once been forgotten. It had become a vessel for all the lost lives, a repository of the unfulfilled. And now it was using them, the crew, to reclaim the stories it had buried. Jake, too, had begun to experience these encounters, though his were more visceral. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing with fear. His dreams were filled with fleeting images, faces and figures that seemed to call his name. He would open his eyes, and for a brief moment, he would believe he was still dreaming. But as the shadows in his room grew longer, as the whispering voices filled his ears once again, he realized that he wasn't in the dream anymore. The nightmares had become his waking reality. What was even more disturbing, however, was that the people in his dreams, the ones that seemed to beg for his attention, the ones that seemed so familiar yet so unreachable, weren't strangers. They were faces he had seen before in the mirrors in the town's old photographs. They were the forgotten ones, the lost souls of Cinnavale who had once inhabited the town, their stories erased, their names lost to time. Mason had started to notice these figures too, but unlike the others, he was determined to understand them, to dig into the town's history and uncover the truth behind the curses that seemed to suffocate Cinnavale. He had spent countless hours combing through ancient records and dusty books, piecing together fragments of the past. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. Cinnavale had not just been a place where films were made. It had been a place where people lived, people who had never left. According to the town's faded history, there had been a strange tradition among the filmmakers, a ritual performed before each film production. They had believed that by invoking the spirits of the past, they could capture the essence of the town's soul and bring it to life on screen. But something had gone wrong. The ritual hadn't just captured the spirits. It had bound them to the town, trapping them in an eternal loop, their lives and stories suspended in time. What disturbed Mason most was the realization that the crew itself had unknowingly walked into the same trap. They hadn't come to Cinnavale to make a movie. They had come to finish a story that had never been completed. And in doing so, they had become part of the town's twisted narrative. The forgotten ones, those trapped souls, were not merely specters that haunted the mirrors. They were the foundation of the town's power, the driving force that kept Cinnavale alive. Every film made here, every news story told, had added another layer to the curse. And now it was their turn. The crew had become characters in a story that was never meant to be told. And in trying to escape, they were merely prolonging the inevitable. The truth hit them with the weight of 1,000 regrets. They had been so caught up in the idea of creating something extraordinary, in making a movie that would stand the test of time, that they had ignored the warnings, the signs that Cinnavale was more than it seemed. They were not the first to come here, and they would not be the last. They were part of an endless cycle, a never-ending production where the cast was always replaced, the story always rewritten, but the outcome remained the same. They were trapped, just like the forgotten ones before them, destined to become nothing more than echoes in the town's insatiable hunger for lost stories. And so, as they sat in the shadows of Cinnavale, the crew began to understand that the true horror was not the mirrors, not the voices, not even the eerie silences. The true horror was the realization that they were not in control of their fate. Cinnavale was a place that had forgotten nothing. It had only been waiting for the next chapter to unfold, for the next story to be told, for the next soul to be consumed. And now it was their turn. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the crew was shaken by a collective realization. They were no longer living in a world where they had any control over their own narrative. The town of Cinnavale, with its decaying streets and shadowed alleys, had begun to feel like a stage where every character, every participant, was merely an actor in a play that had been written long before they arrived. They were no longer the creators of the story. They were the subjects, locked in a twisted drama with no script, no director, and no chance of escape. And the more they tried to fight it, the more they felt the suffocating grip of the town's curse tighten around them. Amelia, once a vibrant and determined filmmaker, had begun to lose her grip on reality. The strange visions she'd encountered in the mirrors were only growing more vivid. It was as though the mirrors weren't merely reflecting her image. They were revealing layers of her existence that she had long buried. Faces she'd never seen before, but somehow knew, now appeared in the reflections. They would stare at her with such sorrowful eyes, as though silently pleading for her to remember something important. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she could not piece together what it was they wanted her to remember. Every time she gazed into the glass, she was pulled deeper into the fog of confusion. It was as if the mirrors were pulling memories from her, memories that were not her own. And with each passing moment, the town seemed to claim another part of her. Jake, too, had begun to break down. The whispers that haunted him in the dark had become unbearable. At first, he thought they were just the result of stress, a mere trick of the mind. But as the voices grew louder, as if speaking directly to him, he couldn't ignore them anymore. They called his name with such urgency, their tone pleading, desperate. And when he looked into the mirrors, they were there, more than just voices now, but figures. He would see them standing behind him, their faces twisted in agony, as if they were frozen in an endless scream. But when he turned to confront them, there was no one there. It was maddening. The more he questioned the reality of what he was experiencing, the more the town seemed to blur the lines between truth and nightmare. Mason, ever the skeptic, tried to hold on to a semblance of rationality. He had spent days going through old town records and documents, searching for any shred of evidence that could explain what was happening. But as the days passed, he began to realize that the evidence wasn't buried in old papers. It was embedded in the very structure of the town. The buildings, the streets, even the weathered film sets seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, a life force that was far from ordinary. And as he ventured deeper into the heart of Cinnavale, he uncovered something terrifying. The town wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It had absorbed the stories, the pain, the memories of everyone who had ever come here. The souls of those who had once lived in this place had merged with the very soil, becoming one with the town itself. And now, those souls demanded that their stories be told. As Mason shared his findings with the others, their sense of dread only grew. They began to understand that Cinnavale had a history far darker than they had ever imagined. The town wasn't just a backdrop for a horror movie. It was a living entity, a parasite that fed on the unfinished narratives of its residents and visitors. The filmmakers of the past had thought they were merely creating stories, but in truth, they had been feeding the town. Each movie made here had added more layers to its power, and now, the crew had become part of that power. Their own stories, their own lives, had been absorbed into the town's vast, dark collection. They weren't just trapped in the town. They had become part of its history, a chapter that had been written without their consent. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that they were playing out roles in a story that had already been set in motion long before they had ever arrived. The mirrors, the ghosts, the whispers, they were all part of the town's need to finish its own narrative. And the crew, in their desperation to escape, were merely adding to the town's eternal loop. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. No matter what they did, Cinnavale would pull them back into its web. The more they resisted, the stronger the town's hold on them became. Amelia, feeling the weight of this truth, began to question her own memories. She had always been so sure of who she was, of the choices she had made, the life she had lived before Cinnavale. But now, every time she gazed into one of the town's many mirrors, her reflection seemed to shift. Her features would blur, her face transforming into someone else's, someone she didn't recognize. It was as though the town was showing her another version of herself, one that had been erased, a version that had never been allowed to live. And the more she tried to hold on to the woman she thought she was, the more her identity slipped through her fingers like sand. It became clear. Cinevale had not just trapped their bodies. It had begun to erase their very selves, replacing them with stories that were not their own. Jake, who had always been the most pragmatic of the group, found himself spiraling into madness. He couldn't escape the voices that called to him in the night. They told him things he had never known about himself, about his past, things that felt like they were true, but also impossibly distant. The more he listened, the more he realized that he wasn't hearing his own voice in the whispers. The words were foreign, like the echoes of someone else's life. And as the whispers became louder, he began to feel as though he were losing himself. The lines between his own identity and the stories of those who had lived in Cinevale began to blur. He wasn't just hearing their voices, he was becoming them. Mason, meanwhile, had begun to piece together the most terrifying discovery of all. The town's history wasn't just written in the old records. It was embedded in the very fabric of the town itself. The buildings were constructed around stories, around lives that had been erased, and the land itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Cinevale wasn't just a town. It was a vessel for the forgotten, a place where the past was kept alive, where stories that had never been told continued to echo through time. And the more they fought against it, the more they realized that there was no escape. Cinevale had become their prison. The crew, now utterly consumed by the town, understood that their fate had been sealed the moment they entered the town. They were no longer creators, but characters in a twisted horror show, their roles dictated by the town itself. No matter what they did, no matter how much they tried to break free, they were part of the narrative now. And in Cinevale, once a story begins, it never ends. The echoes of the past will forever haunt the present, and the forgotten will never be allowed to rest. As the days in Cinevale bled together, the crew members found themselves trapped in a cycle they could no longer escape. Time itself had become a blurred concept, as though the town was altering the very fabric of reality. What they had once assumed were fleeting visions or nightmares now felt more like premonitions, hints at something they were all too reluctant to understand. No matter how hard they tried to break free, to run from the impending nightmare, the town's hold on them only grew stronger. It was as though Cinevale had become the script, and they, the unwilling actors, were simply waiting for their lines to be delivered. Amelia, who had once fought against the town's strange pull with every ounce of her being, now found herself strangely compliant. The urgency to escape, to make sense of everything, had begun to fade. It was as if Cinevale had rewritten her will, inch by inch, until she no longer had the strength to resist. The mirrors, once a source of dread, had become almost comforting. Each time she passed one, she felt the pull to gaze into it, to surrender herself to whatever strange force lay beyond the glass. But now, when she looked into the mirrors, there were no more unknown faces staring back at her. Instead, she saw only herself. Her reflection was empty, void of emotion, as though she had become a mere shell of the person she used to be. The mirrors had stopped showing her the past. They had become a gateway to the future, and it was a future she did not want to face. Jake, ever the skeptic, now found himself tormented by a deeper fear than anything he had ever experienced. The voices were no longer whispers. They had become loud, distinct, filled with urgency. They filled the air, echoing in his mind at all hours of the day and night. Each voice spoke in a different language, a different tone, but they all carried the same message. It's too late. Every time he closed his eyes, the voices would crescendo, as if they were pulling him under a thick, suffocating veil of despair. He no longer heard his own thoughts. He only heard the voices of others. They spoke to him with such clarity, such conviction, that it became impossible to differentiate their words from his own. In a moment of horror, he realized that perhaps it was never his mind that had been his own, but merely an echo of the town's collective voices. Mason, who had clung to his intellectual resolve, was beginning to crack under the weight of the town's truths. He had spent days in the town's abandoned archives, trying to make sense of the strange events and uncover the secret that seemed to bind them all together. The documents he found told a story that was almost too horrific to believe. Cinnavale was not merely a place. It was a living, breathing organism, fueled by the energy of stories left untold. The movies, the ghost stories, the legends, they were all fragments of the town's insatiable hunger. But what disturbed him most was what he found written between the lines of these records. There was no mention of escape. There was no mention of hope. The town had always been this way, forever hungry, forever evolving. And now, it was growing stronger with each passing day. Cinnavale had absorbed them all into its narrative, and now there was no way out. The more Mason pieced together the history, the more he realized that the town had been here long before the first film cameras had ever arrived. It had been built on the blood and stories of those who had come and gone, and with each new story filmed, it grew more powerful, more sentient. The history of Cinnavale was not a simple one. It was a collection of horrors, each one feeding into the other, each one growing in strength. The town was an amalgamation of lost dreams and forgotten deaths, a place where the boundaries of time and space were non-existent. But Mason knew the truth now. The town was not just trapping them, it was preparing them for its final act, its ultimate scene. And they were all playing a role in it, whether they wanted to or not. As the crew gathered in the dilapidated set of the old cinema, they realized that they had all become aware of the same terrible truth. They were the final scene in a movie that had been playing long before they arrived. Cinnavale was not just a town. It was the embodiment of every horror story ever conceived. Each time someone stepped foot in this cursed place, they became part of its never-ending script. The crew was no longer filming a movie. They were living it. And the cameras weren't just capturing their every move. They were directing it, pulling them toward a climax they couldn't avoid. Amelia, her mind clouded and fragmented, whispered the word she had dreaded most: "It's over." Her voice, once full of hope and ambition, now sounded hollow, resigned. She had seen enough. The mirrors had shown her everything she needed to know. The town's grip on them was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was consuming them, piece by piece, until they were no longer individuals, but characters in a story that had no end. And now, they were nearing the final act. There was no escape. There was no running. They had become part of Cinnavale's twisted history, and no matter how they tried to fight, their fate had already been sealed. Jake, whose skepticism had once been his strength, was now paralyzed by the realization that he could no longer deny what was happening. The voices had grown unbearable. He could feel them inside his head, whispering and screaming all at once, pressing against the walls of his mind. He had once thought that he could simply walk away from all of this, that he could dismiss it as madness, as hallucinations. But now, it was clear that Cinnavale had taken hold of him. There was no escaping the town. The voices were not just in his head. They were in the very air around him, woven into the fabric of reality itself. And soon, he would be nothing more than another ghost, another forgotten soul lost in the never-ending narrative of Cinnavale. Mason, though shaken, refused to let go of his understanding of the town's origins. He had realized that Cinnavale was not just a place. It was an idea. It was a living, breathing entity created from the collective fears and desires of everyone who had ever set foot within its borders. Each person who entered the town brought with them a new story, a new set of emotions and memories. And those stories were absorbed, twisted, and reshaped by the town. There was no true ending, no final resolution. Cinnavale was a perpetual loop, a place where nothing was ever truly finished. It was a place where the past, present, and future bled into one another, where every story continued forever. As the crew stood together in that darkened cinema, staring at the looming blank screen, they understood the full weight of what they had become a part of. There would be no credits to roll, no audience to witness their final moments. The movie had no end. They had become characters in a story without resolution, trapped in the infinite cycle of Cinnavale. The cameras, once tools of their art, were now the instruments of their destruction. And with that final realization, the crew embraced their fate, knowing that in the cursed town of Cinnavale, the final scene would never end. In the twilight of their existence, the crew of Cinnavale finally began to understand the true horror of their situation. Not the looming darkness that had hung over them, nor the strange visions and experiences that had so thoroughly disturbed them. No, the true terror came from the undeniable fact that they were trapped in an endless loop. Time was no longer their ally. They were stuck in a cycle of perpetual repetition, forever caught between the beginning and the end, each day indistinguishable from the next. And no matter how hard they tried, they could not break free. The town of Cinnavale had already rewritten their lives, shaping them into pieces of a greater puzzle that had no solution. Amelia, who once believed in escape, now found herself drawn to the very core of the town's power, her will slowly dissolving into the narrative that had been set long before she arrived. She had once believed that she could rewrite the story, change the direction of the plot, but now she realized that she was no more than a character in a script, bound by the constraints of a story that existed outside of her control. The lines she had once fought against had become her reality, and there was no way to undo them. There was no escape from the movie, from the town that had consumed her soul. Cinnavale had her in its grip, and nothing she could do would ever release her. Jake's struggle, however, was of a different kind. He could still hear the voices, their whispers and screams, echoing endlessly in his mind. They had started out as fleeting sounds, distant murmurs he could ignore, but now they were constant, drowning out his thoughts, filling every waking moment with their unrelenting noise. Each voice seemed to speak with a unique cadence, yet all of them carried the same maddening message: rewind. You must rewind. It was a command, not a suggestion. He could feel it crawling under his skin, a compulsion that gnawed at his sanity. The voices were not just haunting him. They were giving him instructions, forcing him to relive the same moments over and over again. It was as though the very fabric of time had become warped, twisted beyond recognition, and each second that passed felt like a repetition of the last. He began to lose his sense of self, unable to discern where his memories ended and the current moment began. Had he lived this day before? Had he always been stuck here? The question lingered in his mind, but he could never find the answer. It was as if the question itself was pointless. There was only the cycle. Mason, ever the rational mind, could no longer hold on to the illusion that logic would save him. He had spent too long trying to understand Cinnavale's mechanics, trying to analyze it, dissect it like a puzzle that could be solved. But the more he delved into the town's twisted history, the more he realized that there were no solutions here, only endless repetitions. Cinnavale was not a place. It was a state of being, an eternal present that consumed all those within its reach. No matter what he did, no matter how he tried to resist, every effort felt like it was merely a prelude to his inevitable return to the same scene. The same set, the same characters, the same lines. The camera would start rolling, and he would play his part once again, each time with less agency, until there was nothing left of his free will. Cinnavale had rewritten him, just as it had rewritten everyone else. The truth was finally clear to them all. Cinnavale was not just a town. It was a prison of time, of stories, of endless rewinds. Each moment they spent there, each action they took, was simply a rerun of the last. The town had captured them in its narrative, and they were doomed to replay it forever. They had once believed they were part of a film, part of a story that could be edited, revised, and ultimately concluded. But now they knew the story could never end. It was the ultimate horror, the realization that they would never get to walk away. They would never see the credits roll. There was no final scene to bow out of. There was only the endless loop of rewinding. Amelia, who had once felt the pangs of despair as the town's hold on her tightened, now felt something different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was acceptance. In this town, in this twisted reality, there was nothing left to fight. She had been erased. Her desires, her hopes, her dreams, all gone, absorbed into the narrative that would never change. There was no grand revelation, no grand escape. She had been rewritten, and so had everyone else. They were not the creators of their fates. They were merely actors, playing roles they hadn't signed up for. And worse yet, their roles would never end. There would be no curtain call. They would live and die in the same moments over and over again, forever. Jake had started to wonder if he had ever truly been himself. Were these voices inside his head his own? Or were they fragments of some greater, more insidious consciousness? The voices weren't just haunting his mind. They were feeding on him, twisting his thoughts, forcing him into a reality that had no escape. He had once thought that by resisting, by fighting against the voices, he could somehow find his way out. But now, he realized that the more he struggled, the more they grew stronger. They didn't just want him to listen, they wanted him to obey. Rewind, relive. The voices no longer spoke in the abstract. They spoke with purpose. They were not merely hallucinations, they were commands. And Jake was too far gone to resist. Mason had once been the skeptic, the one who believed that every problem could be explained, every mystery could be solved. But Cinevale had proven him wrong in the most devastating way possible. There was no explanation for what had happened to them. There was only the endless repetition. The town was not a place. It was a state of perpetual being. It had no beginning and no end. It was the final frontier of horror. The knowledge that escape was impossible, that there was no end, and that they were nothing but pawns in a game that had no rules. Mason had accepted this, not with grace, but with resignation. The town had consumed his mind, his soul, and there was no hope of ever recovering the man he had once been. In the days that followed, they found themselves in the same spot, time and again. The set of the old cinema, where their first dread had started, was now an unavoidable part of their reality. They couldn't leave, and yet they couldn't stay. The cameras rolled, as they always did, and they had no choice but to perform their parts. There was no escape. Every scene played out with a familiarity that made them numb. There was no use in resisting. There was no need to. The loop was their reality, and nothing would ever change. The final truth settled heavily in their minds. They were not just trapped in Cinevale. They were part of it. It had absorbed them, consumed them, and they had become integral to the town's insatiable narrative. And as the cameras rolled again, capturing their every movement, they understood the final horror. There would never be a final scene. There would never be an end. Cinevale had them in its grasp, and the movie would play forever. The town of Cinevale had swallowed them whole. It wasn't just the creeping dread that permeated every corner, nor the distorted reality that blurred the lines between film and life. It was the undeniable truth that they were no longer individuals. They were fragments of something greater, something all-encompassing. Every thought, every movement, every emotion was shaped by the perpetual loop they had found themselves trapped in. Time no longer mattered. Days bled into each other, indistinguishable, a never-ending cycle. There were no tomorrows. There were no exits. There was only the now, and that now would continue forever. Amelia, Jake, Mason, and the others had long since stopped searching for a way out. There was no point in rebellion, no point in desperation. The town had taken everything, their identities, their hopes, their pasts, and had replaced them with an unshakable reality. They were part of the film. Each of them, from the smallest of background extras to the main stars, had their place in the narrative. They had ceased to exist as separate entities, and instead, they had become nothing more than characters in a script that was written long before they arrived. The cameras had seen to that. There was no escape, no choice. They were puppets, and Cinevale was the hand pulling the strings. Jake, once so sure of himself, had learned to embrace the madness. The voices in his head, once tormenting, now felt like a second skin. He didn't fight them anymore. He welcomed their presence because they were the only thing that remained unchanged. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were like old friends, constantly reminding him of his purpose, his role. Rewind, relive. Those two simple words had become his mantra. It was all he could do. Every time the scene started again, it felt like a breath, familiar, inevitable, and endless. It wasn't freedom he had lost. It was the ability to feel anything other than the loop. What was a single life when there were no distinctions between moments? What was freedom when all the choices had already been made? He was part of the film now, and there was no getting out. Mason, ever the thinker, had been the last to truly understand the futility of resistance. His mind, sharp and quick, had once tried to dissect the puzzle that was Cinevale. He had searched for patterns, for clues, for a way to break the cycle. But each effort had been in vain. The more he tried, the more the town resisted. It was as if Cinevale itself was alive, watching, reacting, responding to his every move. No logic applied here. It was as if time itself had become a solid mass, stretching and contracting at will, bending the very laws of existence. The town was not a place to be understood. It was a force to be endured. And endure he did, day in and day out, becoming more and more like the characters he once believed were trapped by the script. His mind had unraveled slowly, not with sudden madness, but with quiet acceptance. It was not the end that mattered. There was no end. There was only the story. Amelia, once a woman full of hope and ambition, had also come to terms with her fate. The narrative had consumed her slowly at first, like a creeping fog that blurs the edges of the world. But now, she knew that resistance was a myth. The illusion of control was just that, an illusion. She no longer fought to escape. She had no need to. All her desires, all her dreams had been swallowed by the all-encompassing void of Cinevale. There was no room for them anymore. The narrative had no need for her to yearn, to strive. It simply needed her to play her part over and over again. And so, she did. The emotions she once held so dearly had withered away, leaving her only with the calm acceptance of her role in the story. The cameras would roll again, and she would be there, in her place, ready to fulfill whatever script was written for her. It was all she knew now. As time passed, the others in the town faded into the background. They became part of the scenery, no longer even characters, but mere elements of the world that had created them. The tourists who came and went, the workers who rebuilt sets and crafted props, all had become as much a part of the narrative as the actors themselves. They moved in cycles like clockwork, their movements preordained and predictable. The town didn't just consume its residents. It consumed all who came within its grasp. Everyone became a part of the grand story, caught in its rhythm, repeating the same actions, speaking the same lines, and walking the same paths over and over again. Even the weather, once unpredictable, seemed scripted now. The wind, the rain, the sun, every detail was part of the scene. It was all so meticulously controlled that no one remembered what it was like before Cinevale took hold. Jake had once believed that he could break free. He had thought that if he resisted hard enough, he could overpower the system. But as the days bled into each other, he began to understand that the town itself was the system. There was no resistance, no escape. There was only the endless rewind. Rewind. He would wake up each morning, as he had the day before, and it would start all over again. The scene, the set, the dialogue, it was all a repetition of the last. And no matter what he did, no matter how he tried to rebel, he would always return to this place, this moment, this role. It wasn't just the town that had him in its grip. It was the very fabric of existence itself. Time was no longer a forward-moving force. It was a loop, an unbreakable cycle, and they were all trapped inside it. In the final moments, the crew of Cinevale stood together, as they had countless times before, at the edge of the set. The cameras were rolling. The director, whose face was now as indistinct as the rest of them, called out the same words. The same actions unfolded, as they had done so many times before. It was not a final scene. It was just another scene. The loop would continue forever. They were not free. They were never meant to be free. The movie, their lives, their existences, they were all part of a grand illusion. An endless illusion, where the actors played their parts, the director called their moves, and time itself refused to move forward. And so, the credits never rolled. The story never ended. Cinevale had become their eternity. There was no escape. There was no final cut. There was only the never-ending rewind. Forever.